In December 1944, German forces committed roughly 200,000 troops and close to 2,000 tanks and assault guns into the Ardennes, aiming to fracture Allied lines and seize Antwerp. The offensive drove a bulge into the American front, measured in dozens of miles deep. At the center of that swelling front sat Bastogne, a Belgian road junction where 7 major highways converged. Control of that crossroads dictated fuel flow, troop movement, and artillery positioning across a wide sector. Without Bastogne, the German advance could outpace Allied coordination. The town was held by elements of the 101st Airborne Division and attached units, totaling around 18,000 men once stragglers and support troops were counted. They possessed limited heavy armor and finite artillery ammunition. German forces encircled Bastogne by December 21st. Artillery shells weighing over 20 pounds impacted frozen ground daily. Rations thinned, medical supplies dwindled. Casualty rates in some rifle companies climbed above 30% within days of sustained bombardment. Inside a foxhole on the frozen perimeter, a paratrooper felt the vibration of German artillery roll through snow-packed soil. Breath condensed instantly in sub-freezing air. Machine gun barrels required constant clearing to prevent ice formation. Ammunition boxes, each weighing dozens of pounds, were rationed carefully. A single artillery battalion defending the town could fire hundreds of rounds in a day, but resupply by air depended on weather measured in cloud ceiling and wind speed. At that same moment, General George S. Patton's Third Army sat oriented eastward in Lorraine, engaged in its own operations. Third Army fielded over 200,000 men and hundreds of tanks, including M4 Shermans, weighing around 30 tons each. A single armored division under Patton required hundreds of tons of fuel and ammunition weekly to sustain offensive action. When the German offensive fractured the Ardennes front, Allied High Command required immediate recalibration. Patton proposed a 90-degree pivot northward, an operational maneuver requiring the redirection of entire corps across icy roads clogged with retreating units and civilian traffic. Moving 3 divisions in winter conditions meant coordinating thousands of vehicles, from tanks to trucks carrying fuel measured in tens of thousands of gallons. Road networks in the Ardennes were narrow, forested, and vulnerable to air and artillery interdiction. I remember reviewing Third Army movement logs from December 1944 and tracing the timing of divisional repositioning. What stands out is not rhetoric about speed, but the cold precision of march tables. Units began shifting within days. Columns advanced through snow, engines idling to prevent oil thickening beyond function. Maintenance crews worked overnight to keep vehicles operational. The pivot did not rely on inspiration alone. It relied on disciplined staff work measured in hours. On December 22nd, German envoys demanded Bastogne's surrender. The American reply, "Nuts," has become shorthand for defiance. But defiance alone does not sustain a defense. Artillery ammunition inside Bastogne was finite. Medical facilities overflowed. Without relief, the perimeter would eventually erode. By December 23rd, weather cleared sufficiently for Allied aircraft to deliver supplies. Cargo planes dropped ammunition bundles weighing hundreds of pounds, medical kits, and rations into contested fields. Simultaneously, Patton's leading elements advanced toward Bastogne from the south. German units attempted to stall the approach with anti-tank guns firing armor-piercing rounds capable of penetrating several inches of steel. Roadblocks fractured momentum. Bridges required rapid repair under fire. Inside a Sherman tank advancing toward the town, the crew felt the hull shudder over frozen ruts. The 75mm gun remained loaded as infantry advanced alongside. Fuel gauges were monitored constantly. A stalled vehicle in a narrow road could halt an entire column. German artillery targeted choke points. Casualties accumulated, but the advance did not stall completely. On December 26, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne's perimeter. The encirclement fractured. It did not vanish instantly. Fighting continued for weeks, but the immediate risk of annihilation receded. Patton's Third Army had collided with German forces at a moment when speed determined survival. Strategically, the German offensive depended on rapid seizure of road networks and fuel depots. German armored units consumed gasoline at rates measured in gallons per mile. When progress slowed, fuel stocks dwindled. Allied air power, once weather improved, struck German columns, igniting trucks carrying thousands of gallons. The offensive, which had penetrated deeply, began to erode under combined pressure from north and south. Bastogne mattered because of its roads. 7 highways radiating outward meant control of movement across a wide sector. If Germany held the junction, reinforcement and supply to other Allied units would fracture. Patton's maneuver preserved that node. It forced German planners to divert strength to contain Third Army, rather than exploit breakthroughs elsewhere. Breaking an encirclement in winter is not cinematic. It is mud frozen into iron, engines that refuse ignition, infantry marching through snow with packs weighing over 50 pounds. It is artillery crews calculating fire missions with gloved hands stiff from cold. It is supply officers counting gallons remaining in tanker trucks. When I compare German operational objectives with the timeline of Patton's pivot, the conclusion sharpens. The Third Army outpaced German expectations. The 90-degree turn recalibrated the southern shoulder of the bulge before German forces could consolidate. Speed, in this instance, equaled preservation. The relief of Bastogne did not end the Battle of the Bulge. It fractured the German plan. By January 1945, Allied counter-offensives compressed the salient from multiple directions. German losses included hundreds of tanks destroyed or abandoned, thousands of vehicles immobilized by fuel shortage, and tens of thousands of casualties. The offensive that sought to split Allied lines instead accelerated German attrition. If you are listening now, perhaps as night settles and warmth contrasts with that winter battlefield, imagine a column of armored vehicles grinding north through snow, headlights dimmed, engines humming steadily. Ahead, a town ringed by smoke waits for relief. Behind, supply trucks count their remaining gallons. The road narrows, then opens. The encirclement thins. The sound of engines replaces the silence of isolation. This is the entire history of how Patton's Third Army saved Bastogne. Chapter 1. The Fingerprint on the Forecast. The 9th of December, 1944. Nancy, France. A converted office building on a cold street, requisitioned by the United States Third Army as its headquarters. Inside, the corridors smell of damp wool overcoats and cigarette smoke, and the particular sharp odor of mimeograph fluid that anyone who worked in a wartime office building would recognize instantly. The heating is inadequate. The windows rattle in their frames. Outside, the Allied armies are pointing eastward, toward Frankfurt, toward the Rhine, toward what everyone in that building has been told is the beginning of the end of the war. In the intelligence section, the G2 shop, in Army parlance, a colonel named Oscar Koch is laying out a set of maps on a table that has been pushed against the wall to make room. He isn't flamboyant. Contemporary accounts describe him as precise, methodical, the kind of officer who double-checked everything before he said it out loud. He has been double-checking this particular analysis for the better part of 6 weeks. Now, with Patton's Saar offensive only 10 days away, Koch has called a special briefing, not because anyone asked him to, because the data won't let him stay quiet any longer. What Koch had assembled by that morning wasn't a single dramatic revelation. It was a pattern, a slow accumulation of details that individually meant little, but together pointed somewhere uncomfortable. He'd tracked the movement of German panzer divisions out of the front line through November. Of 15 known panzer divisions in the Western Theater, only 5 remained in active contact with Allied forces by early December. The other 10 had simply disappeared from the reconnaissance maps. Gone. Not destroyed. The order of battle section would have tracked that. Just absent, as though they'd been picked up and placed somewhere out of sight. Aerial reconnaissance had detected 226 train movements on a single day in November, all heading north and west, away from the Third Army's planned axis of advance, and toward a sector that Allied intelligence had categorized, officially, as quiet. Koch had also received a prisoner of war report describing a secret German order routing English-speaking soldiers and captured Allied uniforms to a training area, which suggested something far more specific than a routine defensive buildup. He placed all of this in front of Patton on that December morning and said, in effect, "I believe the Germans are preparing a major counteroffensive through the Ardennes." The briefing was met, according to the Army's own account of the event, with a brief silence, then discussion. Patton's response, as recorded in the Army's own historical summary of that meeting, was, "We'll be in a position to meet whatever happens." Plans for the Saar offensive would continue, but Koch was told to begin outline contingency planning for a northward attack, quietly, without formal order, without disruption to the primary mission. It was a characteristically Patton response, Acknowledge the intelligence, don't panic, but don't ignore it either. Here's what I find striking when I look at the wider picture. Koch's analysis wasn't uniquely brilliant, it was uniquely acted upon. The intelligence that pointed toward the Ardennes was available to multiple Allied commands in the weeks before the German offensive. The 12th Army Group had its own intelligence staff. SHAEF had its own. In each case, the conclusion reached was something similar to low probability, or German capability for this exists, but intent is uncertain. What Koch provided, and what the Army's own post-war summary makes explicit, wasn't better collection, it was better evaluation. He was willing to tell his commander something unwelcome, and Patton was willing to listen. When I was cross-referencing the timeline of Koch's December briefings against the contingency planning records available through the 3rd Army After-Action Report, I found it notable that by the 14th of December, just 2 days before the German attack, the 3rd Army's G2 periodic report was explicitly warning that, and I'm quoting the documented summary here, the Germans were making every effort to employ this armor in a coordinated effort, and were bending over backward to avoid piecemeal commitment. That language is not cautious hedge betting. That is a professional intelligence officer telling you, in the driest possible bureaucratic vocabulary, that something large is coming. The Saar offensive was still being planned, the preliminary air bombardment was still scheduled, and Koch's warnings were still being filed, documented, dated, signed. The 15th of December arrived. The Germans went on radio silence across their entire front. To most Allied commands, this read as routine. To Koch's section, it was the last indicator they needed. Patton had already told his Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, and his operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, to develop specific plans for pulling the 3rd Army out of its eastward attack and driving it north into Luxembourg. Not general plans, specific ones, with routes named, with corps assignments outlined, with axes of advance ranked in order of priority. The Saar offensive maps were still on the table. The northward contingency plans were being drawn up on the table next to them. To me, the most revealing detail in this entire opening chapter isn't a battle or a briefing. It's the quiet fact that by December 15th, the eve of the German offensive, Koch's section had already identified 9 German divisions facing the 8th Corps sector to the north. That was nearly 3 more divisions than faced the entire 3rd Army, 4 more than faced the 7th Army to the south. And the American sector they faced was held by a corps that had been designated as a rest and refit area. The numbers were right there. The routing stamps were on the reports. The coffee had gone cold in the cups. The 16th of December came before dawn. In the Ardennes, along a front that stretched roughly 130 kilometers through forest and fog and frozen river valleys, 3 German armies crossed into American lines simultaneously. The 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, drove into the center. The 6th SS Panzer Army, under Sepp Dietrich, hit the north. The 7th Army pressed the south. For most of the Allied command structure, it arrived without warning. Sudden, enormous, and terrifying in its scale. In the 3rd Army's G2 section in Nancy, a carbon copy of Koch's December 9th briefing was already in the file, probably with a coffee ring on it from someone setting a cup down on the way to somewhere else. Koch's own summary, published years later in his monograph on intelligence in the Patton Command, draws a distinction that doesn't get quoted enough. He wrote that the failure preceding the bulge was not a failure of intelligence collection. It was a failure of evaluation and application. The information was there. It had been there for weeks. What failed wasn't the system of gathering facts. What failed was the institutional willingness to accept an unwanted conclusion and act on it. That's a quieter kind of failure than a dramatic surprise attack. It's harder to photograph and harder to dramatize. But it's the failure that actually shaped what happened next. And it's the reason that the 3rd Army, and really only the 3rd Army, was ready to move when the call came. The Eastern Front was dark. The radio networks were quiet. Somewhere in the Eifel Hills, 25 German divisions were already moving west through the trees. Chapter 2. The Butcher's Bill Comes Due. The 16th of December, 1944, 0530 hours. The Ardennes, along a stretch of the Belgian-Luxembourg border that in peacetime is noted for its forests and its small stone market towns, and its particular kind of gray winter silence. That silence ended at 0530, when German artillery opened along the length of the front. Not a probing fire, not a ranging shot, but a full preparatory barrage designed to destroy wire communications before a single rifle was fired. It lasted 90 minutes. By the time it ended, most of the forward American positions had lost all telephone contact with their regimental headquarters. They were fighting blind before they were fighting at all. The division that caught the worst of the central blow was the 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division, raised from Pennsylvania National Guard units, its shoulder patch a red keystone that German soldiers had taken to calling the Bloody Bucket for the color and the shape, and the fact that wherever it appeared, the casualties tended to be severe. The 28th had just come through the Hurtgen Forest, a grinding campaign through dense woodland that had cost the division roughly 6,184 casualties in 2 months, more men than the authorized rifleman strength of an American infantry division. They had been sent to the Ardennes specifically because the sector was considered quiet, a rest area, a place to rebuild, to refit, to absorb replacements and try to reconstitute something like a fighting force. They had been there less than 3 weeks. The regiment at the center of the German blow was the 110th Infantry, commanded by Colonel Hurley Fuller, holding a front of roughly 28 kilometers with the forces available to a single regiment, forces that had not been brought back to full strength after the Hurtgen losses, that were still integrating replacements, that were spread thin across a front that a division would have found difficult to hold in comfortable circumstances. The 110th's morning report for December 17th contains, in the column for effective strength, a number scratched out and replaced by the word unknown. That entry tells you almost everything about what the first 24 hours looked like. By the 19th of December, the regiment had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting formation. 2,750 men from the regiment were killed, captured, or missing in the first days of the German attack. What the Germans were attacking toward wasn't primarily the town of Bastogne itself, at least not in the initial operational concept. General von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army needed the road network. Bastogne sits at the intersection of 7 major roads in the southern Ardennes, and the specific objective was the N34 highway running southwest, the only all-weather route capable of sustaining the supply convoys that Manteuffel's armored force would need to reach the Meuse River. Without that road network, the German central thrust would begin to starve within 72 hours of bypassing the town. The Germans needed Bastogne's roads even more than they needed Bastogne itself. That's a distinction that most general accounts skip over, but it's the operational key to understanding why the next 10 days unfolded the way they did. The fight at Clairvaux, in Luxembourg, is where the human cost of the defense becomes visible in the most immediate way. Colonel Fuller's regimental command post was in the castle at Clairvaux, a medieval stone structure overlooking the town, which sounds dramatic and almost cinematic, and the stone walls were presumably not unappreciated. But it was not a fortress in any useful military sense. The castle became the last organized defensive position of the 110th Infantry's command element, and Fuller was eventually captured there on the 17th. The fact that the final act of a 20th century regimental defense was played out in a castle built 7 centuries earlier is one of those details that a documentary scriptwriter might be tempted to lean on for atmosphere. I'm noting it because it actually happened, not because it's picturesque. The historical debate about what the 28th Division's defense actually accomplished is one I think deserves more honest attention than the popular record usually gives it. Charles MacDonald, whose 1985 account of the Bulge remains the most thorough single-volume English-language treatment of the battle, argued that the 28th Division's fighting withdrawal delayed the 5th Panzer Army's timetable by approximately 24 hours, and that this 24-hour delay was the operational margin that allowed the 101st Airborne Division to occupy Bastogne before German armor arrived. John Eisenhower, writing in 1969, put the delay at closer to 18 hours and suggested the road network's natural bottlenecks, the narrow valley approaches, the destroyed bridges, the frozen secondary roads, deserved as much credit as the deliberate American defense. The distinction is not academic. If MacDonald is right, the men of the 28th Division saved Bastogne by the act of standing and dying in its path. If Eisenhower is right, the geography saved it, and the men died in addition to that fact, rather than because of it. I don't think either version dishonors them, but I think the honest answer is that we don't know with precision, and the official history's confidence on this point is somewhat greater than the evidence supports. When I was looking at the 28th Division's equipment and supply records for December, I found a figure that sits with me in a particular way. In the fighting withdrawal from the 16th through the 19th, the division lost an estimated 400 tons of ammunition, either destroyed in place to prevent capture, or taken by German forces who found American supply dumps in the chaos of the retreat. 400 tons. That figure will come back into the story inside Bastogne's perimeter, where the defending forces would be rationing their artillery to 10 rounds per gun per day, while calculating precisely how many days they had left. The ammunition that was lost on those roads in Luxembourg in December, the rounds that were blown up in snowbanks or loaded onto German vehicles, was exactly the kind of tonnage that McAuliffe's staff would have given almost anything to have on December 22nd. The retreat of what remained of the 28th Division westward toward France in the days that followed was not a rout. It's important to say that clearly, because the records show organized elements fighting delaying actions at multiple points along their line of withdrawal. But it was a catastrophe by any operational measure. 614 killed, 2,605 wounded, 855 missing, over 750 non-battle casualties, the majority of them trench foot, a condition caused by wet feet in near-freezing temperatures that renders a man unable to walk, and was entirely preventable with dry socks, which the division didn't have enough of because they hadn't been resupplied adequately during their rest period in a sector that nobody expected to become a battlefield. Into the space left by the 28th Division and into the town of Bastogne itself, the American command was now trying to get the 101st Airborne Division, a unit pulled from its rest area at Mourmelon-le-Grand in France, loaded onto trucks without full equipment issue, without some of its officers who were on leave, and driven through the night toward a battle that nobody had completely explained to them. The first elements arrived in Bastogne to find retreating soldiers from the 28th Division coming the other way, some without weapons, some without boots, all of them moving away from whatever was behind them. The 101st's own unit diary records this first encounter with what the division was moving toward with a spare, factual brevity that is more eloquent than any dramatization. The 110th Infantry Regiment's morning report, that single word, unknown, where a number should have been, is the document I keep returning to from this period. Not the battle maps, not the order of battle summaries. A clerk at a field desk, trying to fill in a form in the standard way, arriving at the column for effective strength, and finding that the correct bureaucratic answer was that he didn't know what was left of his regiment, and filling in the form anyway, submitting it through channels, the institution grinding forward on its own momentum, even as the thing it was meant to record was ceasing to exist around the people doing the recording. The German advance continued through the night. Somewhere north of Clairvaux, columns of armor were moving west on roads that hadn't seen tank traffic in decades. The forests were dark. The Ardennes were doing what they had done in 1914 and 1940. They were swallowing armies whole, and what emerged on the other side was never quite what had gone in. Chapter 3. The Man Who Already Had a Plan. The 17th of December, 1944. 3rd Army Headquarters, Nancy. The situation reports from the north were arriving in fragments, partial, contradictory, and frightening in the scale of what they implied. Bradley's headquarters was still trying to decide whether this was a spoiling attack or something larger. SHAEF was beginning to use the word crisis in its internal communications. Most of the American senior command structure was doing what organizations do when faced with an event that contradicts their assumptions. They were trying to absorb the information without admitting what it meant. George Patton had already moved past that stage. His diary entry for the 16th of December reads, "We should not worry. I believe this will be the death knell of the German army." That line gets quoted regularly as evidence of Patton's characteristic bombast, the theatrical self-confidence that made him either inspiring or insufferable, depending on your relationship with him. But read it in the context of what Koch had briefed him on December 9th, in the context of the contingency plans already being drafted in the operations section, and it looks less like bluster and more like a man telling himself, and his diary, that the plan he's already made is the right one. The bravado and the professional preparation were running on the same track. What is less widely reported about those first 48 hours is the specific sequence of private decisions Patton made before anyone in the Allied chain of command had formally authorized him to do anything. On the 17th, he telephoned Brigadier General Gay and told him to stop both the 4th Armored Division and the 80th Infantry Division in their tracks and begin preparing to turn them northward. These 2 divisions were currently deployed for the Saar offensive, the attack that was supposed to begin on the 19th. Patton was, in effect, unilaterally suspending preparations for his own planned operation on the basis of a German attack that his superiors were still characterizing as unclear in scope. That afternoon, he also issued what the records describe as a warning order to the newly arrived 3rd Corps commander, Major General John Milliken, telling him to get north and get familiar with the ground. Not an operations order, not a formal directive, a warning. Go look at the terrain you're going to be fighting through, because you'll be fighting through it very soon. The evening of the 17th produced the meeting at Bradley's headquarters that the after-action records and the HistoryNet reconstruction together document in some detail. Patton arrived with his intelligence, operations, and logistics officers. Gay had been instructed to bring the full staff within 10 minutes of receiving Bradley's call, and they left that quickly. The picture that emerged from Bradley's briefing was larger and more dangerous than even Patton's staff had fully appreciated. 7 panzer divisions committed, 7 infantry divisions. The German salient was expanding. Patton later admitted in his diary that the scale of the German gains surprised him. He had expected a significant attack. He hadn't expected this. But he'd already told Gay to start moving divisions. The admission of surprise and the forward preparation were simultaneous. The mechanics of what was being asked of the Third Army's staff in these 48 hours are worth dwelling on, because the popular version of the story compresses them into something that sounds almost simple. Moving an army, 3 corps, roughly 250,000 men, their tanks and trucks and artillery pieces and supply dumps and signal wire and medical equipment and fuel reserves, through 90 degrees on a winter road network in Belgium and Luxembourg, is an engineering problem of extraordinary complexity. Corps orders had to cascade to divisions within 8 to 12 hours. Divisional orders reached regiments in 4 to 6 hours. Regimental orders reached battalions in 2 to 3 hours. Simultaneously, the military police had to reposition to manage road intersections on an entirely new axis. The Signal Corps had to begin laying new wire communications along the northward routes. Engineer battalions had to pre-survey Belgian roads for weight limits, because a Sherman tank at 30 tons and the heavier Pershing at 41 tons could destroy an unimproved Belgian secondary road in a single convoy pass in warm weather. And this was December. The Army's logistics section, specifically Brigadier General Walter Muller, the Third Army's G4 officer, had begun, before receiving any formal authorization, to pre-stage supplies at forward depots along what would become the northward axis of advance. 8,000 tons of artillery ammunition moved north without a written order, on a verbal acknowledgement from Gay, on the understanding that if the Verdun conference on the 19th produced the expected result, the supplies needed to already be there. I want to be direct about something here, because it matters to understanding what actually happened. Patton's performance at the Verdun conference on the 19th of December, the meeting at which he announced he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours, and produced coordinated operational plans apparently from thin air, was remarkable. It was also, in a very specific sense, theater. Not dishonest theater, but theater nonetheless. The plans he presented at Verdun had been drafted the night before. The divisions he named had been moving for 24 hours. The supplies he would need had been pre-staged by Muller. When Eisenhower asked how soon he could attack, Patton was not improvising. He was delivering the result of several days of staff work that he'd initiated before anyone asked him to. The astonishment in the room at Verdun, Bradley reportedly offering him some leeway in case he was being overconfident, was genuine. The preparation behind the apparent spontaneity was equally genuine. When I look at the Verdun meeting through the lens of the prior week's staff work, what strikes me most is the role of Patton's chief of staff, Brigadier General Gay. It was Gay who called Milliken and told him to get familiar with the northern terrain. It was Gay who coordinated with Muller on the pre-staged supplies. It was Gay who, on the night of the 18th, sat down with Milliken and his staff and worked through the approach, march routes that the attack corps would use, without yet knowing the specific objectives, according to the HistoryNet account, but agreeing on routes in advance so that when the objective was confirmed at Verdun, the movement orders could be issued immediately. Gay keeps appearing in the documentary record as the operational implement of decisions Patton had framed. the man who translated the commander's intent into the actual physical movement of large formations on winter roads. He is not a celebrated figure in the popular history of Bastogne. The myth doesn't have room for a meticulous chief of staff. The road and supply movement figures that Patton's aide, Colonel Codman, assembled after the war are documented and specific. By the time the Third Army's pivot was complete, 63,000 tons of supplies had been shifted in 5 days. 4,500 tons of ammunition were being moved per day. 2,800 miles of road were reconnoitered by transport officers. 20,000 miles of signal wire were strung to create an entirely new field communication system on a new axis. Hundreds of thousands of new maps, totaling 57 tons by weight, were distributed down to unit level. Those numbers are the operational substance of what the myth calls a miraculous 90-degree turn. They are also the work of thousands of men whose names do not appear in the film versions of this story. Patton drove directly from Verdun to Luxembourg without returning to his Nancy headquarters. Gay stayed in Nancy, coordinating the movement. The 4th Armored was already heading north through Longwy. The 80th Infantry was moving toward Luxembourg City. By midnight of the 18th, one combat command of the 4th Armored had begun the road march that would eventually end, 8 days later, at the wire of the 101st Airborne's perimeter south of Bastogne. 8 days, not 48 hours. The myth compresses it to 2 days. The roads and the German defenses and the frozen Belgian terrain would have something to say about that. The night of the 18th was cold in a way that the meteorological records for the Ardennes region confirm was below the seasonal average. Temperatures in the range of 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit along the routes the Third Army columns would use, with ice on road surfaces estimated to cover roughly 60% of the usable surface area on secondary roads. The truck drivers chaining their wheels in the dark, the signal corps men in the ditches running wire, the staff officers in borrowed Belgian buildings bent over maps and telephone receivers, solving the equations of an army in motion. The conference at Verdun had been the visible moment. This was the invisible one, and it was already underway. Chapter 4. Nuts, the word on the paper. The 19th of December, 1944. Trucks were moving through the night on Belgian roads toward a town that most of the men riding in them had never heard of. The 101st Airborne Division was arriving in Bastogne in the dark, some units still missing equipment that hadn't been issued before the departure from Mourmelon, some without their commanding general, who was in Washington attending a planning conference and was now racing back to Europe on a transport aircraft. The man in command was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander, the artillery officer who had been running the division's operations in Major General Maxwell Taylor's absence. He was not the permanent commanding general. He would not be the permanent commanding general after the battle was over, but he was the man in Bastogne for the days that the siege was at its worst, and the decisions he made during those days were his alone. By December 21st, the encirclement was complete. 8 German divisions surrounded the town. The perimeter the 101st was holding was roughly a circle approximately 8 kilometers across, through forest and farmland in sub-zero temperatures, against forces that outnumbered the defenders by the most commonly cited estimate of approximately 5 to 1. Inside the perimeter, alongside the 101st, were elements of the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, various artillery and engineer units, and the soldiers of the 28th Division, who had retreated into the perimeter during the German advance. The total defending force was somewhere in the region of 18,000 men. The critical resource was ammunition. The 101st's medical officer was tracking wound cases. The G4 section was tracking round counts. Artillery had been rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Normal defensive consumption is between 25 and 40 rounds per gun per day, depending on the intensity of the attacks being received. McAuliffe's staff had done the arithmetic. They knew, to within a day or two, how long they could sustain the defense. The 22nd of December arrived. 4 German officers approached American lines under a white flag and delivered a formal typed surrender demand to the 101st's command element. The document called on the American commander to surrender the encircled forces to prevent, in the German phrasing, unnecessary bloodshed. McAuliffe read it. According to the most detailed account available, that of Captain Harry Kennard, McAuliffe's aide, whose diary is the primary source for what happened next, McAuliffe's immediate reaction was to say something to the effect of, "Aw, nuts," before setting the paper down and walking away to deal with other matters. It was only when reminded that a formal written reply was expected that the question of what to send back to the German officers arose. Here, the sources diverge in a way that I think is worth being honest about, because both accounts are from people who were present. Kinnard's account, the most cited, describes McAuliffe turning to his staff and asking for suggestions, and Kinnard himself proposing that nuts was tough to beat. Colonel Joseph Harper, who was given the task of physically delivering the reply to the German officers, describes McAuliffe writing the word himself, immediately and without consultation. Both men were in the same building. Both accounts have been published and cited by reputable historians. They cannot both be completely accurate. What is not in dispute is what was typed on the paper and delivered. A formal military address block at the top, in the practiced hand of a headquarters clerk, and then a single word. The bureaucratic normalcy of the form makes the response more striking, not less. Whatever the precise sequence of its composition, the reply left Bastogne's command post on a standard piece of army stationery. The air supply operation that began on December 23rd, when the weather broke for the first time in 7 days, is the part of the siege story that tends to get reduced to a single paragraph in general accounts. It deserves more than that, because the logistics of what was actually delivered versus what was needed tells you something precise about how close the margin actually was. 241 C-47 transport aircraft flew resupply missions into Bastogne between the 23rd and the 26th. The total delivered was approximately 850 tons of all supply types. Of that figure, approximately 144 tons was artillery ammunition, 263 tons was rations, 98 tons was medical supplies, and 76 tons was small arms ammunition. Against the defending force of 18,000 men under sustained attack, the minimum daily requirement runs well above 200 tons per day in ammunition alone. The air supply operation was keeping the defense alive. It was not keeping it comfortable. On December 23rd, the first clear day, approximately 16% of the paradrop materiel landed outside American lines, directly into German-held territory. German forces recovered and used that materiel. The besiegers were being partially resupplied by the besieged. The 23rd also brought the weather that Koch's December weather prayer would later be credited with producing, though, as I'll note more fully in the next chapter, the Third Army's own weather officer had forecast this clearing high-pressure system as early as December 20th, 3 days before it arrived, on the basis of standard meteorological analysis. What the clear weather actually meant on the ground was this. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force flew 647 attack sorties against German positions around Bastogne in a single day. German armor that had been operating with impunity for a week under the cloud cover was suddenly visible and exposed. The tactical airstrikes on December 23rd and 24th did not break the siege, but they prevented the German forces from massing the kind of concentrated armor assault that might have broken through the perimeter. Christmas Eve brought the largest German assault on the perimeter to that point, a coordinated armored and infantry attack from the northwest that penetrated to within the town's outer buildings before being stopped. Tank fire struck the main aid station. The approximately 450 wounded inside, men who had been waiting on surgical procedures that the supply shortage had placed on hold, were moved to a basement that was simultaneously being used as an ammunition storage point. This is documented in the 326th Airborne Medical Company's own log, which I find one of the harder documents in this archive to read without stopping. Not because it's dramatic, because it's not. It lists the men moved, the quantities of supplies shifted to accommodate them, and the note that procedures postponed due to supply constraints were resumed after the air resupply of December 23rd. The log entry maintains its standard format throughout. Christmas morning, McAuliffe distributed a typed message to every unit in the perimeter, mimeographed on a hand crank machine, and carried by battalion runners to men in frozen foxholes along a circular front roughly 25 kilometers in circumference. The message asked, "What's merry about all this, you ask? We're fighting. It's cold. We aren't home." It acknowledged what the men were actually experiencing, rather than claiming it was something other than what it was. McAuliffe then went on to describe the German encirclement as something remarkable rather than catastrophic, not because of what it proved about American superiority, but because of what it had already failed to accomplish. The defense had held. Approximately 11,000 copies of that message were made and distributed. The number feels specific in a way that matters. It means someone counted. Someone decided exactly how many to print. That's also a kind of precision. What I keep returning to, sitting with these documents, is the arithmetic that McAuliffe was doing in the quiet moments between crises. Not the dramatic single-word reply. That was a moment of public resolve, and it was real. But the private calculation, available rounds divided by estimated daily consumption, divided by the estimated date of relief, and the answer that kept coming back as a specific number of days that was both certain and insufficient. The men who hold positions under siege and choose not to surrender are often described in terms of courage, which is accurate but incomplete. What McAuliffe was also doing was mathematics. He had looked at the numbers and concluded that the numbers, though bad, weren't quite bad enough to justify the alternative. That distinction, between bad enough and not quite, is where the defense of Bastogne actually lived, and it's a colder and more precise thing than heroism, though it took heroism to execute it. Patton's army was on the road, the corridor wasn't open, the arithmetic was still running. Chapter 5. The Spreadsheet That Moved an Army. The 20th of December, 1944, a 4-page mimeographed table, standard Third Army format, marked as a daily supply summary. In the column labeled Diversion Factor, the percentage of scheduled supply tonnage being redirected from its originally planned destination to a new one, the entry for December 20th reads 73. 73% of all Third Army's supply tonnage scheduled for the eastward Saar offensive had been physically turned around and sent north. The entry for December 19th reads 0. Between those two numbers, on a single row of a logistics table that probably nobody outside a G4 section would ever read, is the entire operational achievement of the Third Army's pivot. Not a speech, not a battle, a percentage. The officer responsible for that number was Brigadier General Walter Muller, 3rd Army G4, the logistics officer whose name appears in almost no popular account of the Bastogne relief. Muller had begun pre-staging supplies northward before the Verdun Conference authorized him to do so, a decision that was technically a violation of 12th Army Group supply allocation protocols, and that would have resulted in a formal inquiry if the conference had produced a different outcome. It didn't, because Patton had told Gay, and Gay had told Muller, in the language of professional soldiers operating in the same command climate, that the conference would produce orders to go north, and that the supplies needed to be there before the order arrived. Muller moved them. The 8,000 tons of artillery ammunition pre-staged along the Arlon-Bastogne axis before December 19th was the physical prerequisite for Patton's performance at Verdun. Without it, the 48-hour attack timeline was a boast. With it, it was a schedule. The fuel requirement alone for the Third Army's northward movement is worth examining in some detail, because it makes the achievement concrete in a way that operational maps don't. The attack force, 3 divisions under 3rd Corps, with corps-level artillery and support elements, required approximately 1.2 million gallons of gasoline to move from its current positions to the line of departure north of Arlon, Belgium. That fuel existed in forward depots, and its existence in those depots was partly a matter of contingent luck. The logistical slowdown imposed on the Third Army during the Saar offensive in November had left partially consumed reserves at 2 forward supply points that were now, serendipitously, positioned along the new northward axis. The war has a great many of these moments where the consequence of one failure, the supply interruption of November, becomes the enabling condition for a later success. Muller's staff had tracked those reserves precisely. They knew the fuel was there. They'd been watching it sit in depots all month, waiting for the Saar offensive to consume it, and it hadn't been consumed yet. The vehicles doing the moving were primarily the GMC 2.5-ton truck, the Deuce and a Half, as it was universally known, the backbone of American Army logistics in the European theater. Its payload was 2.5 tons on improved roads, 1.5 tons off-road. Its 6-wheel drive allowed operation in mud and light snow, but on ice-covered Belgian secondary roads, drivers were required to chain all 6 wheels before operating, a process that took approximately 45 minutes per truck and had to be performed manually in temperatures hovering around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The Third Army's motor pool records for December 20th through 22nd show approximately 340 trucks breaking down or involved in road accidents during the northward movement phase. 340. Each breakdown on a single-lane Belgian road required a recovery vehicle to clear the obstruction before the following convoy could proceed. Average clearance time? Approximately 2.5 hours per incident. Military police were positioned along the routes with orders to manage the intersections, and the traffic control logs from this period show a system operating at the boundary of its capacity, not beyond it, but right at the edge. 14,000 tons of supplies shifted northward in the 72 hours between December 19th and December 22nd, averaging approximately 194 tons per hour around the clock. Those are the numbers from the Third Army's own records. What the numbers don't capture is the ambient temperature, the ice on the road surfaces, the fact that the drivers had been in sustained operations for months, the fact that the replacement drivers who filled gaps in the rosters were often men who'd had minimal training on European road conditions. The quantitative achievement and the human cost of achieving it are not the same thing, and the logistics records only document one of them. The other one is in the letters, and it tends not to get counted. When I was working through the motor transport records from this period alongside the supply diversion tables, I found it genuinely striking that Muller's pre-staging decision, the one that made the whole operation possible, left almost no trace in the formal record of who decided what and when. The 8,000 tons of artillery ammunition moved north before authorization appears in the supply logs as a fait accompli. The logs show the supplies are at forward positions on the morning of December 20th. They do not show who ordered them there, or when, or on what authority. That absence isn't unusual in wartime logistics records. It's very common. Actually, the paper trail is thinner when people are moving fast and acting ahead of their orders. But it means that Muller's contribution, the thing that made Patton's Verdun performance credible, exists in the record primarily as an effect, rather than as a decision. The cause has been mostly lost. Muller received no specific decoration for this action. His name does not appear in the 1970 film. The engineer battalions are another part of this story that the operational summaries tend to compress. 3 engineer bridge companies moved north ahead of the combat forces, specifically to survey the Sour and Alzette river crossings before the lead armor arrived. 2 bridges were found to be destroyed. One was rated at only 25 tons, which was insufficient for Sherman tanks. Engineers worked through 2 nights to lay Bailey bridges, a modular military bridging system assembled from prefabricated steel panels that a company of roughly 40 engineers could erect for a 100-foot span in approximately 4 to 6 hours under good conditions. These were not good conditions. The temperatures were below freezing. The riverbanks were icy. The Bailey bridge panels weighed between 200 and 700 pounds each, depending on the component type, and had to be manhandled into position by men working in the dark. Both crossings were ready before the lead armor arrived. That fact is noted in a single sentence in the 3rd Corps operations log. The 3rd Corps attack formally began at 0600 on December 22nd. 3 divisions moving north, the 4th Armored on the western axis, the 26th Infantry in the center, the 80th Infantry on the east. The 3rd Corps log entry for the jump-off is timed at 0600 hours. Muller's fuel and ammunition inventory at that moment showed reserves sufficient for precisely 72 hours of sustained operations. Not 73, not 96, 72, 3 days. After that, the supply system needed to catch up to the advancing formations, or the attack would stall. There was no margin for significant delay. The German forces between the 3rd Corps and Bastogne were about to introduce some. The GMC trucks were still moving north on the N4 highway. The Bailey bridge panels were being dragged into position on frozen riverbanks by men whose hands were too cold to feel what they were handling. The supply logs were being updated in real time by clerks in borrowed Belgian buildings, penciling in tonnages and diversion factors and fuel consumption rates against a clock that was running faster than anyone would publicly admit. The men doing this work didn't get paragraphs in the after-action report. They got a diversion factor column that went from 0 to 73 overnight. And somewhere in that number precisely was the reason Bastogne didn't fall. Chapter 6. The God of Weather. The 8th of December 1944, before the German offensive, before the encirclement, before the corridor and the cold and the counted rounds. 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, a morning that the record describes without drama, a phone call. General George Patton called Colonel James Hugh O'Neill, the chief chaplain of the 3rd Army, and asked him a question that O'Neill later recalled with considerable precision. "Do you have a good prayer for weather?" Patton said. "We must do something about those rains if we are to win the war." O'Neill, who before entering the priesthood had worked as a newspaper editor and brought a journalist's memory for specific dialogue to his later published account, recalled that Patton appeared entirely sincere, not theatrical, not performative, genuinely concerned, as a commander, about the persistent low cloud and fog that had been grounding Allied tactical air support and giving German ground forces the freedom of movement that Allied air superiority was otherwise designed to deny them. O'Neill composed a prayer for clear weather, a short text asking God to grant fair weather for battle. Patton read it, requested a revision to the final line, and here is a detail that I find particularly interesting. The original final line was changed, but O'Neill's own published account doesn't tell us what it originally said. The revision was made. The prayer was printed. 250,000 copies, on a 3x5 cardstock, folded in half, with a Christmas greeting from Patton on the reverse side. 1 copy per soldier in the Third Army. The Christmas greeting asked every soldier, Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish, to pray. The distribution was accomplished through the standard Army supply chain, routed through the regimental chaplains, passed down to company level, 1 card per man. This happened in the second week of December, and this is the point I need to dwell on for a moment, because the popular narrative has the sequence backward. The prayer was composed and distributed for the purpose of supporting Patton's planned Saar offensive, the eastward attack scheduled for December 19th. It was in soldiers' pockets before the German offensive began. It was in soldiers' pockets before Bastogne was surrounded. The famous theological story, Patton calling for prayer to break the weather over Bastogne and the skies miraculously clearing, is true in its atmospheric outlines, but false in its timing. The prayer was already there. The subsequent application of its fulfillment to the Bastogne story was a retrospective connection, made because the clearing on December 23rd happened to coincide with what had been printed on the card 2 weeks earlier. That coincidence is real. The causal claim is harder to defend. The meteorological facts are documented in Third Army weather records and are somewhat inconvenient for the theological narrative. The Army's own weather officer had forecast a high-pressure system moving in from the north as early as December 20th, 3 days before the clearing actually arrived on December 23rd. The forecast was based on standard meteorological analysis of pressure gradients and air mass movements, the same methodology any Army weather section would have applied in the same circumstances. The clearing came when the forecast said it would come. This doesn't disprove anything theological, and I want to be careful here about what I'm actually claiming. I'm not dismissing the prayer or its value to the men who carried it. I am noting that the Army's own instruments predicted the same event, on the same timeline, by entirely non-theological means, and that the documentary record supports both observations simultaneously, without resolving which caused what. What the clearing weather actually delivered on December 23rd is documented in the 9th Air Force mission logs, with the same dry precision as the supply tables. 647 attack sorties against German positions in a single day. The primary ground attack aircraft was the P-47 Thunderbolt, carrying up to 2,500 pounds of bombs and armed with 8 50-caliber machine guns. Its primary anti-armor weapon was the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, capable of penetrating approximately 4 inches of rolled homogeneous armor at a 30-degree angle, effective against German Panzer IVs and half-tracks, less effective against the frontal armor of the heavier Panther or Tiger. So the tactical air campaign of December 23rd was devastating against German logistics columns and medium armor, and less decisive against the heavier formations. The supply columns it destroyed, an estimated 3,200 tons of German fuel and ammunition that never reached frontline units, according to post-battle assessments, were the more significant achievement. An Ardennes counteroffensive that was already fuel short became catastrophically fuel short in the 24 hours of clear sky on December 23rd. The weather was, in a precise operational sense, the most effective weapon deployed in the Bastogne campaign. More effective than any single ground action, harder to decorate or document. The prayer card's journey from O'Neill's desk to the hands of a paratrooper in a frozen foxhole on the Bastogne perimeter is a logistics story as well as a spiritual one, and this is where I find myself thinking about what the card actually meant to the men who held it. 250,000 men carried it through what the meteorological records confirm was an average temperature of approximately 20 degrees Fahrenheit across the relevant period. And I want to note that average means the nights were colder, and the nights in the Ardennes in December 1944 were very long. The men carrying those cards were not primarily soldiers of faith or soldiers of doctrine. They were cold people, holding a small printed card that told them their commanding general had thought to ask God for better conditions. Whatever the theology, the psychology is documentable. Patton was telling 250,000 men that he understood the weather was killing them, that he'd taken it seriously enough to print and distribute a prayer, and that he believed the situation could change. Command communication, morale architecture, practical pastoral care, all three things at once on a 3x5 card. O'Neill received the Bronze Star for composing the prayer. The citation is preserved in his service record and references, specifically, the morale value of the prayer distribution. It is, to my knowledge, the only Bronze Star awarded in the Second World War for the composition of a religious text. The decoration sits in the historical record as a curiosity that most military historians note briefly and then move past. I find I can't move past it quite as quickly, because the logic of the decoration is actually coherent. If you believe that morale is a combat multiplier, and the Army believes this, formally and at doctrine level, then the act of maintaining morale under the conditions of December 1944 is a contribution to the combat outcome that can legitimately be recognized. Patton understood this. The Bronze Star is the formal acknowledgement that he was right. Whether you agree with the mechanism or not, the architecture of the argument holds. The 23rd of December arrived. The clouds broke. The P-47s flew. The supply convoys from the air started falling into the Bastogne perimeter, with their partial tonnage and their 16% wastage rate into German lines. And somewhere on the Ardennes front, a German panzer column that had been moving comfortably under cloud cover for a week was suddenly visible from above, and the weather that everyone on the Allied side had been waiting for arrived on schedule, as the forecasters had said it would, and as the prayer cards promised it would. And the precise weight to give each of those two facts is a question the archive cannot answer, and I suspect always will be. Patton's 3rd Corps was moving north. The 4th Armored was fighting through villages south of Bastogne. The prayer cards were in the pockets of the men on both sides of that fight. The skies were clear. The clocks were running. Chapter 7. Iron Road South. The 22nd of December, 1944, 0600 hours. The sky above southeastern Belgium was still dark, and the temperature along the Arlon-Bastogne road sat at approximately 12 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to turn exhaust fumes into solid fog that hung between the pine trees and the road surface in slow, drifting columns. The 4th Armored Division's lead elements stepped off at exactly the time the 3rd Corps operations log records them, and immediately began fighting a battle that had nothing to do with German soldiers. The road itself was the first enemy. An 18-foot-wide asphalt strip over gravel base, listed in the Belgian road maintenance records as suitable for commercial traffic, was now carrying Sherman tanks weighing 30 tons apiece, 2 tons above the shoulder weight limit for the road surface. In the dark, on ice. The 4th Armored had made a 150-mile road march from its assembly areas to reach the jump-off line north of Arlon. That move alone, conducted over 3 nights between the 18th and the 21st of December, had consumed roughly 50,000 gallons of fuel and put significant mechanical stress on vehicles that had been in nearly continuous operations since the Normandy breakout in July. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, the division's spearhead unit, had been wearing out tanks and naming each one Thunderbolt since France. By December 1944, he was on his 4th. The man and the machine both showed the wear of 6 months of hard fighting, and neither had stopped for long enough to fully recover. The division's 3 combat commands, A, B, and Reserve, moved north in parallel columns, with Combat Command B under Colonel Wendell Blanchard holding the primary western axis toward Bastogne, and Combat Command A on a secondary axis to the right. The Reserve stood ready to exploit a breakthrough that, for the first 4 days, refused to develop. Martelange arrived on the 22nd. The Sûre River crossing at Martelange was a natural choke point, a narrow valley with a single bridge that the retreating American forces had destroyed to slow the German advance. It had done that job. Now it was slowing the American advance instead. The 44th Engineer Combat Battalion brought up Bailey Bridge components and began construction. 14 hours. That's how long it took to lay a bridge capable of supporting the Sherman tanks. 14 hours during which the German 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, the paratroopers holding the ground north of the river, was using every available minute to dig in, lay mines, pre-register artillery, and turn the next village into a prepared defensive position. The bridge went up. The division crossed. But the timetable had already absorbed a blow it couldn't fully recover from. Chaumont arrived on the 23rd. This is where the sources diverge in a way I find genuinely instructive. The 4th Armored's official history and the after-action documentation from the American side describe the German defense at Chaumont as a reinforced battalion of infantry supported by armor, a significant force requiring a deliberate assault to reduce. The captured war diary of the German 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, translated and reviewed by Army historians post-war, describes the Chaumont position as a reinforced company with 2 Sturmgeschütz assault guns. A company versus a battalion is a difference of roughly 300 men against roughly 800. If the German account is more accurate, Combat Command B spent 12 hours, through the 23rd of December and into the night, being held by a force roughly a third the size of what American commanders believed they were facing. That discrepancy doesn't diminish the difficulty of the fighting. It raises a harder question about whether the tactical handling of those hours was as sharp as it needed to be. Patton was watching the clock. His diary entry for the 25th of December reads, without any holiday sentiment whatsoever, "This has been a very bloody battle. I hope to God the 4th Armored gets through tonight." The composure that characterized his Verdun performance, the calm certainty, the pre-written plans, the studied confidence, had by Christmas given way to something rawer. He had promised to relieve Bastogne. The 4th Armored had covered 22 miles in 5 days against a distance of 30. The gap was narrowing, but not fast enough. And inside the perimeter, the ammunition supply was still rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day, while McAuliffe's staff ran their arithmetic. Patton could read arithmetic too. He drove to the forward command posts. He talked to Gaffey. He pushed. And the division still moved at the speed the terrain and the weather and the Germans allowed it to move, which was not the speed that Patton demanded. The decision that broke the stalemate came from below, not above. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, standing on a piece of high ground near the village of Clochimont on the 25th, was looking north toward Bastogne, 5 miles away, when the sky above the town filled with C-47 transports, dropping the afternoon's supply load. He'd already lost 20 tanks to the fighting since the 22nd. 20 medium tanks was what the Army considered the minimum for one more full assault. His own after-action account describes looking at a Belgian topographic map, a 1 to 25,000 scale sheet that, according to the sources, had been found in an abandoned building along the route rather than issued through normal intelligence channels, and identifying a secondary road through the village of Assenois that appeared less heavily defended than the primary axis. The map wasn't part of the division's issued intelligence packet. It was a local document, printed in a scale the Army doesn't typically use, found in what appears to have been a schoolhouse. Abrams brought it to Gaffey. Gaffey approved the axis change. The plan for the 26th was made. When I sit with the maintenance records for the 4th Armored Division across those 5 days, I find myself returning repeatedly to a single figure. 73 Sherman tanks required field maintenance during the advance, track replacements, engine work, gun repairs, representing roughly a third of the division's tank strength. Of those, 11 were total losses before reaching Bastogne. The Continental R-975 radial engine powering the Sherman had a particular vulnerability to extreme cold. Oil viscosity thickened below approximately 10 degrees Fahrenheit, extending cold start time from the normal 2 minutes to as much as 30, and reducing peak horsepower output by roughly 15%. On frozen Belgian secondary roads, where the traction coefficient for steel tracks on ice is approximately 0.2, compared to 0.6 on dry ground. This power reduction could prevent a Sherman from climbing grades steeper than about 8 degrees. The Ardennes secondary roads regularly presented 12 to 15 degree grades. Tank crews learned not to fully shut down engines during halts. This increased fuel consumption by approximately 35% over normal rates, and accelerated the logistics crisis that Muller's team was working continuously to stay ahead of. The corduroy of fact beneath the narrative here is this. The 4th Armored Division's drive to Bastogne was not stalled by inadequate courage or insufficient will. It was slowed by the specific physical properties of winter terrain, a road network narrower and less capable than the planning had assumed, mechanical limitations of the equipment, and a German paratroop division that, even at reduced strength and fighting a delaying action, knew how to use frozen river valleys and prepared village positions to extract the maximum cost for every meter of Belgian road. 22 miles in 5 days, against those conditions, with those vehicles, on those roads, cost the 4th Armored Division approximately 1,000 men killed and wounded before the 26th even arrived. The 37 lost 5 dead, 22 wounded, 5 missing. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion lost 30 killed and 180 wounded. These are the numbers behind the phrase, "drove like hell." Outside the village of Clochimont, the night of December 25th settled over the snow-covered fields. 5 miles north, the artillery inside the Bastogne perimeter was down to its reserve loads. The secondary road through Assenois ran northeast through a fold in the ground, through trees, through a German-held village, and up a ridge that nobody outside the 5th Fallschirmjäger had walked in daylight. In the morning, Abrams would take 20 tanks and whatever was left of the 53rd's infantry and drive straight up that road without stopping. Chapter 8. The Corridor. 25 minutes. The 26th of December, 1944, 3 in the afternoon. Abrams stood in the turret of his Sherman. He called this one Thunderbolt 4, the 4th tank to carry the name since France, and looked north across a landscape of bare fields and dark pine ridges, toward a town he'd been trying to reach for 5 days. He had 20 medium tanks left. The 37th Company C, under 1st Lieutenant Charles Boggess, would lead. Company C of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel George Jakes, would ride half-tracks behind the tanks through the village of Assenois and mop up while the lead tanks drove through without stopping. 2,340 artillery shells were prearranged to fall on German positions in and around Assenois as the column moved. A fire mission designed to suppress the defenders long enough for the first vehicles to punch through before the Germans could organize. The plan required Boggess to drive through his own artillery fire. This was accepted. There wasn't another way to do it. Abrams radioed Major General Gaffey at the 4th Armored Division headquarters and asked for authorization to move. The word came back a few minutes after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Abrams stuck what the after-action accounts describe as a large cigar in his mouth and transmitted to his battalion. "We're going into those people now. Let her roll." Those words are documented in the Army's own account of the action and in the post-war interview given by Captain Stedman Sini, the division's assistant operations officer. That's the recorded language, not a speech, not a soliloquy. 5 words and a command. The column moved at 16:45 hours, according to the 4th Armored Division operations log. 4:45 in the afternoon, with the Belgian winter dusk already beginning to leach the light out of the sky. Boggess's tank, bumper number C6, later known as Cobra King, led the column down the slope from Clochimont, through a patch of woodland, and into the village of Assenois. The artillery was falling as the tanks entered the village, which means that shells were landing in the buildings Boggess's tank was driving between, the noise and concussion adding to the chaos of machine gun fire and the distinctive crack of tank guns firing at point-blank range. Corporal Milton Dickerman, Boggess's gunner, later told a reporter that he used the 75mm main gun like it was a machine gun, firing 21 rounds in a few minutes. Loader Private James Murphy was, in Dickerman's words, plenty busy throwing in shells. The column did not stop to clear the village. The companies that followed, the armored infantry and their half-tracks, would do that. Boggess drove through. North of Assenois, behind the village, the road ran up a ridge through heavy woods where the German defenders had blockhouses covering the approach. Boggess's tank, with 2 or 3 other Shermans still in contact behind him, drove up the ridge under fire. 4 Shermans were lost on the approach, destroyed or disabled in the fighting through Assenois and on the ridgeline road beyond. Behind the first wave, German forces detonated teller mines that had been buried in the road surface, destroying a half-track carrying 53rd Battalion infantry. Several men were wounded. The mines were triggered after the lead tanks had passed, separating Boggess from the infantry support that was supposed to follow him. He was effectively alone, one tank, 4 remaining crew, driving north on a Belgian forest road toward a perimeter held by men who had been under siege for 8 days and who had reports of German troops using captured American uniforms. The moment of contact is documented in Bogus's own words from a December 1949 article in the European Stars and Stripes. North of Assinois, the column encountered American combat engineers in U.S. uniforms assaulting a German pillbox. Bogus, aware of the uniform capture intelligence, called out from his open hatch to identify them. The engineers identified themselves as members of the 101st Airborne's Company A, 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. Bogus then destroyed the pillbox with his main gun and drove forward to the perimeter wire. The 4th Armored Division log entry for 1650 hours on December 26th reads, CCR, 37th TB, Copen C, relief of Bastogne effected. 13 words, no exclamation. The clerk who typed it used the standard, abbreviated format for a routine objective secured. At approximately 17:10 hours, Abrams drove to the McAuliffe's headquarters in Bastogne, and the two men shook hands. McAuliffe's first question, according to the accounts of those present, was about what supplies were in the relief column. Not congratulations, not victory declarations, supply inventory. Here's what I want to say clearly, as a researcher, because the popular record doesn't. The corridor that was opened at 1650 hours on December 26th was a single road, approximately 500 meters wide at its narrowest point, running through territory that was still under German observation and indirect fire. Through the night of the 26th and into the 27th, German forces attempted 4 times to cut the road and re-encircle Bastogne. Each time they were beaten back by a combination of 4th Armored tanks, driving south out of the perimeter, and 101st Airborne Infantry holding the shoulders. The first supply convoy, 27 trucks carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and rations, passed through that corridor at approximately 0300 hours on the 27th, guided by military policemen with red lens flashlights, under intermittent German artillery fire. The siege was over. The battle was not. Cobra King, the tank, bumper number C6, M4A3E2 jumbo variant, one of only 254 of that type built by the Fisher Tank Arsenal, survived the 26th. It survived the weeks that followed, too. It remained in Germany after the war, was photographed at a barracks in Germany in 1958, sat unidentified and largely forgotten for decades, and was confirmed as the Bastogne relief tank by U.S. Army historians in December 2008, 64 years after its arrival at the perimeter wire. The tank is now at the National Museum of the United States Army. It had been standing at the back gate of a garrison in Germany for over a decade before anyone connected it to what it had done. The most important tank of the Ardennes campaign had been sitting, unlabeled, at the back of a car park. What strikes me when I look at the complete record of December 26th is the gap between the log entry and the reality it describes. 13 words, CCR, 37th TB, Company C, relief of Bastogne effected. The efficiency of that language is not coldness. It's the grammar of a military organization that has trained itself to record events as data points rather than drama, because drama stops the forms getting filled in. But behind those 13 words, 5 days of grinding advance, 1,000 casualties, a tank driven through its own artillery fire by a 25-year-old lieutenant from Illinois, 21 main gun rounds in a few minutes, 4 Shermans lost on the ridgeline, German mines closing the road behind the lead tank, a handshake in the dusk between the man who had been waiting and the man who had arrived. And then the forms. Always the forms. The corridor was 500 meters wide, and it was under fire, and the first thing McAuliffe asked about was the supply manifest. That's Bastogne, precisely. Chapter 9. The General Who Arrived Late. The 27th of December, 1944, Bastogne. The corridor had been open for less than 24 hours, and the German artillery was still working systematically on the road south of the town. Inside the perimeter, the 101st Airborne Division had been fighting continuously for 8 days, under a commander who held the title Acting. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had arrived in Bastogne in the dark on the 19th, had rejected the German surrender demand on the 22nd, had written the Christmas message to his troops on the 25th, had coordinated the air resupply operations, managed the perimeter defense under sustained assault, and done all of it without formal authority as the permanent commanding general of his division. That authority belonged to Major General Maxwell Taylor, who had been in Washington, D.C. when the German offensive began, attending a planning conference on the future of airborne operations, and who had spent 8 days trying to get back to Europe. Taylor arrived at Bastogne on the 27th. The 101st Airborne Division's war diary records the command handover in a single brief paragraph, noting that Taylor assumed command from McAuliffe without ceremony, and with the active fighting around the corridor still ongoing. The accounts of people who were present describe the meeting as businesslike, McAuliffe with a situation map, Taylor taking the briefing. This is documented. What is harder to document, and what I find myself weighing carefully as a historian, is the emotional texture of that moment. An acting commander, having conducted one of the most celebrated defensive battles in American military history, handing over to the permanent commander who was not there for any of it. The situation map presumably captured the perimeter lines, the supply status, the casualty figures. It did not capture the 8 days that produced them. Taylor had been sent to Washington for legitimate institutional reasons. The conference he attended was examining whether the heavy losses and mixed results of Operation Market Garden in September 1944 had effectively ended large-scale airborne operations as a viable tactical concept. Taylor was the right man to be in that conversation. He was also, as a result, not in Bastogne, and the question of whether that absence should affect the historical credit assigned to the defense is one the documentary record handles somewhat awkwardly. Taylor's 1972 memoir, Swords and Plowshares, covers the Bastogne period with a structural emphasis that several historians have noted. More pages are given to Taylor's journey back to Europe and the fighting that followed his arrival than to the 8-day defense itself. This isn't fabrication, it's a choice about what the story is. And choices about what the story is are how historical credit gets distributed. The Presidential Unit Citation awarded to the 101st Airborne Division for the defense of Bastogne was processed through the formal chain of endorsement, while McAuliffe was still in command, which means that for part of its journey through the bureaucracy, the commanding general endorsing McAuliffe's citation was McAuliffe himself, a loop that the Army's paperwork system produced naturally from the circumstances, without anyone intending it. Colonel Joseph Harper, who had delivered the nuts reply to the German officers on the 22nd, submitted a separate memorandum during the citation process, arguing that McAuliffe should be individually named in the formal citation header, rather than appearing only in the narrative body. The memorandum is in the record at the National Archives. The citation header was not amended. I want to be careful here about what I'm actually arguing, because I'm not suggesting Taylor behaved dishonorably. The accounts of his post-war interactions suggest he spoke generously of McAuliffe's performance and made no public claim to credit for the siege defense itself. What I'm examining is something more structural, how institutional authority and individual performance interact in the historical record when they happen to be separated from each other at the critical moment. Taylor's name is on the division. The citation carries his name in the header. The popular culture, the films, the television productions, the books aimed at general audiences, has largely resolved the question in McAuliffe's favor. Nuts belongs to McAuliffe in the public imagination, in a way that no later command relationship can revise. But the institutional record and the popular memory are pointing in different directions, and both are gesturing at a real tension that the archive can identify, but cannot fully resolve. Taylor had been in Washington fighting a different kind of institutional battle, the one about whether airborne divisions had a future at all after Market Garden. The losses at Nijmegen and Arnhem had been severe enough that serious voices at SHAEF were questioning whether the resources invested in training and equipping airborne formations were justified by their operational results. Taylor was making the case for the airborne concept's survival as a military instrument. He did so while his division was, coincidentally and without his direction, providing the most compelling possible evidence for that case. The irony is real. He was defending the airborne's institutional existence in one room, while the airborne was defending Bastogne in another room entirely. When I look at the gap between the two narratives, the Taylor who is present in the records of the Washington Conference, and the McAuliffe who is present in the Bastogne perimeter logs, I find myself thinking about what command actually means, and where its legitimacy resides. The Army's formal answer is in the assignment orders. The human answer, which is less tidy, is somewhere in the 8 days of artillery and rationed ammunition, and Christmas messages mimeographed on a hand-crank machine. Both answers are real. The institution insists on the first one. The history keeps insisting on the second. The corridor south of Bastogne was still being held open by tired men in frozen ditches on the night of the 27th. The supply trucks were moving north through intermittent fire. Inside the town, McAuliffe had handed over his situation map and stepped back from the command he'd held for 8 of the most consequential days in any general officer's career. The war diary recorded the handover in its standard paragraph format. Somewhere in the margin of that bureaucratic moment is a question the record poses but declines to answer. What does it mean to be the general who was there? Chapter 10. The German Side of the Wire. The 19th of December, 1944, 5th Panzer Army Headquarters, somewhere in the Belgian-Luxembourg borderland, a farm building requisitioned by General Hasso von Manteuffel's staff. The operational map on the wall showed German armor moving west, with the speed that the first days of the offensive had promised. The 67th Panzer Corps was pushing north and west of Bastogne. The 47th Panzer Corps, the Panzer Lehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division was tightening the ring around the town. On paper, the encirclement was nearly complete. On the same map, annotated in red, was the road network that Bastogne controlled. 7 spokes radiating from the town center, including the routes that Manteuffel's supply convoys needed to reach the Meuse. Every day the town held, those routes were denied to him. The German operational diary's entry for December 19th contains a phrase that has been cited in post-war analyses with striking consistency. Bastogne must be taken. Every day of encirclement is a day of lost momentum. Manteuffel's decision to initially bypass Bastogne, rather than assault it directly, was made in the first hours of the offensive on the 16th, when speed toward the Meuse seemed more important than securing a road junction that could be reduced later. It was the right operational instinct for the moment it was made, and the wrong decision for every moment that followed. The 101st Airborne's arrival in the town during the 17th and 18th transformed what had been a partially garrisoned crossroads into a prepared defensive position that would require a deliberate assault by forces Manteuffel could not afford to commit without stopping his westward momentum. He had bypassed a gap and returned to find a fortress. The formal surrender demand of December 22nd, the one that produced nuts, was Manteuffel's attempt to end the problem by negotiation before it became permanent. It was also, in his own post-war assessment, a tactical error. The demand advertised the extent of the encirclement to the American commanders, and he believed hardened the defense at a moment when ambiguity about the German strength might have produced a different calculation. He said this in a 1952 interview with Army historians. His own Army's communication logs from December 22nd show the demand was issued on his direct orders. The post-war admission and the contemporary documentation point in slightly different directions, and I don't think that tension resolves in Manteuffel's favor. The fuel situation inside the German 5th Panzer Army by December 23rd is where the larger strategic story lives, and it's a story that the popular English-language account of the Ardennes tends to subordinate to the narrative of American heroism. The 5th Panzer Army's logistics records for December 16th through 26th document total fuel consumption of approximately 4.2 million liters, against a projected requirement of 6.8 million liters for the planned Meuse River operation. That shortfall of 2.6 million liters, roughly 660,000 gallons, was not primarily the result of the fighting at Bastogne. It was the product of Allied air interdiction of German supply lines that began in earnest when the weather cleared on December 23rd, and of a German fuel stockpile that had been undersized from the beginning of planning because the German 7th Army on the southern flank had consumed more than its allocated share in the opening phase. The Panther Ausführung G, Germany's most effective medium tank in the Ardennes, armed with a 75mm high-velocity gun that could penetrate American Shermans at ranges exceeding 1 kilometer, consumed 2.5 liters of fuel per kilometer on road and 4.5 liters per kilometer cross-country. Its total fuel capacity was 730 liters, giving a theoretical road range of approximately 290 kilometers. In the Ardennes, with its winding roads and frequent cold start fuel consumption, a cold start could consume 30 to 40 liters per attempt. Effective operational range dropped to approximately 150 to 180 kilometers. The Meuse River was roughly 100 kilometers from the German start line. Reachable, in theory. Not reachable without forward fuel resupply at each operational bound. And the Allied air campaign that opened on December 23rd was hitting German fuel convoys with the systematic precision that 647 P-47 sorties in a single day can achieve. At the town of Celles, Belgium, approximately 4 miles from the Meuse River, the westernmost point reached by any German formation in the entire Ardennes offensive. A panzer unit of the 2nd Panzer Division ran out of fuel on Christmas Day. A German tank commander's diary, captured and translated by Allied intelligence and cited in post-war analyses of the battle, records that on Christmas Eve he could see lights across the Meuse. He describes the river. He describes the lights on the far bank. He writes that he believes they will reach the river in the morning. His tank was destroyed by British armor on December 26th, the same day the Assenois corridor opened 100 kilometers to the southeast. The German offensive reached the Meuse in exactly the way a wave reaches the high tide mark. It arrived at the limit of its energy, stood still for a moment, and began to recede. The fuel tanks were empty. The supply lines were burning. The German failure at Bastogne and the German failure at the Meuse are connected in a precise causal chain that the popular account typically separates into 2 parallel stories: Patton's brilliant relief and the German supply crisis. But they aren't 2 stories. The road network at Bastogne was the logistical artery the German central thrust needed to sustain its western movement. Every day the Americans held it, the German supply columns that should have been using those roads were taking longer routes, burning more fuel, arriving late or not at all. The town wasn't just a symbol, it was a valve. McAuliffe's defense closed the valve. Patton's relief prevented the Germans from reopening it. The German panzers at Celles ran dry in part because the road through Bastogne was in American hands. When I cross-reference the German logistics documents with the American supply records, what I find striking is how precisely the 2 failures, American supply inside the perimeter and German supply outside it, mirror each other. McAuliffe's artillery was down to 10 rounds per gun per day. Manteuffel's panzers were receiving 30% of their required fuel allocation. Both sides were conducting their operations on the narrow margin of what was physically available, not what the planning documents had specified. The difference was that the Americans had Patton's pre-staged supply chain coming from the south. The Germans had the P-47s coming from above. The German operational records for this period are honest in a way that post-war German memoir literature is not always honest. Manteuffel's own assessment, filed with American military historians in the early 1950s, describes the bypass decision as the single most consequential error of his personal command in the Ardennes. He doesn't hedge this. He names the decision and the date. The precision of his self-criticism is striking in a document produced by an officer reviewing his own defeat. Whether that precision reflects genuine reckoning or the retrospective wisdom of someone who has had years to understand what went wrong, the documents don't resolve. Both things are possible. By the 26th of December, the German offensive was not yet formally over. Hitler had ordered a counterattack to seal the Bastogne corridor. The orders were real. The forces to execute them were not. The high water mark at Celles was being mopped up by British tanks. The Meuse was still on the other side of the river. Chapter 11. The Corridor They Tried to Kill. The 27th of December, 1944. The Assenois Road. The corridor to Bastogne was 500 meters wide at its narrowest point, and it was being used for the first time as a supply route under conditions that the military police responsible for managing it would later describe, in the dry language of their traffic control log, as intermittent interdiction fire. This is the military bureaucratic way of saying that shells were landing on the road while the trucks were driving on it. The MPs were posted every 500 meters with a standing order. If a vehicle was disabled on the road, it was to be pushed into the ditch immediately, regardless of the status of its occupants, to keep the lane clear for the convoy behind it. The order was operationally rational. It was also the kind of order that requires a specific kind of professional detachment to actually carry out at 0300 hours in a Belgian ditch in December. The 24th Engineer Combat Battalion arrived at the corridor on the 27th and began what its daily work log records with characteristic matter-of-factness. Improved road surface, Assenois-Bastogne, 1.2 kilometers. Placed corduroy on 400-meter soft shoulder section. Came under artillery fire, 0840 to 0920, Suspended work. Resume 0925. 45 minutes of suspension. Then back to laying logs in frozen ground. Corduroy construction. Burying logs perpendicular to the road axis to distribute weight over soft ground. Proceeds at approximately 100 meters per hour under good conditions. Under intermittent fire, that rate drops to roughly 40 meters per hour, because men spending time in ditches are not spending time laying timber. The 1.2 kilometers noted in the log represents approximately 30 engineer hours of work, which checks against the personnel records showing 2 platoons operating from 0630 to 1900 with the documented interruption. The arithmetic of the work log is, in its own way, a form of witness. The German 5th Fallschirmjäger Division hadn't finished. Through December 28th, 29th, and 30th, German infantry conducted repeated attacks on both shoulders of the corridor, probing for the point at which the 4th Armored's southern pressure and the 101st's northern flank could be separated. On December 28th, one German thrust penetrated to within 200 meters of the Assenois Road, before being driven back in a counterattack that the 4th Armored's combat records describe as close and confused. The military vocabulary for fighting, in which the standard geometric clarity of battle maps does not apply because the sides are too close together to maintain it. The corridor survived each of these attacks, but never with a margin large enough to reduce the tension. The road remained single lane for most of its first week. A destroyed vehicle was a 50-minute interruption. A successful German penetration to the road was a potential closure. Patton visited the corridor on the 30th of December and wrote in his diary, "The road is still very narrow and is under fire. We must widen it." He formally requested additional engineer assets that same day. Third Army's after-action report credits this visit with initiating the road widening effort. But the 3rd Corps engineer staff's own records show the request for additional engineers was submitted on December 28th, 2 days before Patton arrived. This is a small discrepancy in the documentary record that probably reflects the normal dynamics of how command visits get credited in official histories rather than any deliberate misattribution. But it is a real discrepancy, and I note it because it goes to a larger pattern in this story. The official record consistently credits the commander rather than the staff, and the staff's own records quietly document a different sequence. Hitler's ordered counterattack to seal the corridor arrived in the first days of January 1945, and it was not a token effort. German forces attacked from both flanks of the corridor simultaneously on approximately January 3rd and 4th, in what the German operational records describe as a coordinated pinching movement, intended to isolate Bastogne again before the Allied supply buildup inside the perimeter could shift the operational balance. For approximately 36 hours, the corridor was reduced to intermittent use. The supply trucks held at both ends, while the infantry and armor fighting on the flanks prevented the road from being used with any reliability. The 101st Airborne's medical log for this period documents the practical consequence with clinical precision. Resupply of blood plasma was delayed, and 2 surgical procedures were postponed pending restoration of supply access. The war was always, underneath the operational abstractions, about whether or not the plasma arrived on time. Between December 27th and January 9th, the 13 days required to secure and widen the corridor, approximately 32,400 tons of supplies were moved into Bastogne, averaging roughly 2,500 tons per day. Compare this to the maximum achievable by air resupply, approximately 315 tons per day during the siege. The difference between air supply and road supply is a factor of approximately 8-to-1 in tonnage capacity. That factor is the operational difference between a force that can survive and a force that can attack. By January 9th, the corridor was approximately 4 miles wide and under reliable artillery cover. The German counterattack had failed. The supply line was operating. Bastogne had gone from besieged town to operational base in the space of 2 weeks of engineering work conducted under artillery fire by men who kept filing their work logs in standard format. The additional casualties incurred in those 2 weeks of corridor defense are the part of the Bastogne story that almost no popular account mentions. The 4th Armored Division's losses in the fighting to keep the corridor open from December 27th through January 9th, approximately 400 additional casualties and 40 armored vehicles, exceeded its losses in the original drive that opened the corridor. The breakthrough on December 26th cost the 37th Tank Battalion 5 killed, 22 wounded, 5 missing. The subsequent 2 weeks of corridor defense cost the division roughly 8 times that. The famous day of the opening, the corridors being a victory, Boggess shaking hands with the engineer lieutenant, is the moment that gets remembered. The subsequent fortnight of exhausted, unglamorous defense of the supply line that made the opening matter is harder to frame as a story. There is no single moment of drama. There are work logs, there are supply manifests, there are medical logs noting that the plasma arrived at 0430 rather than at 0200 as scheduled because the road had been under fire. The corduroy roadway built by the 24th Engineers on December 27th held up under approximately 12,000 trucks during the 2-week period, according to the battalion's end-of-period maintenance report. 12,000 trucks, over 400 meters of log roadway, in temperatures averaging around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying everything from artillery ammunition to blood plasma to spare tank treads to dry socks. The logs held. The road stayed open. Bastogne was saved not once, but continuously, by men who filed their work logs in standard format and went back to laying timber after the shells stopped falling. Chapter 12. The Prayer Book and the Rifle. The 23rd of December, 1944, a cellar somewhere in the Bastogne perimeter. The supply problem wasn't abstract to the men living inside it. It was a very specific calculation, not tonnage, not diversion factors, not supply manifests, but something more immediate and personal. A single chocolate D-bar ration divided between 2 men and a letter home that hadn't been written yet because the outcome was still too uncertain to commit to paper. The grand operational story of Patton's pivot and Koch's forecast and Muller's pre-staged ammunition exists at a level of abstraction that the men on the perimeter line didn't have access to. They had what was in front of them, behind them, and in their immediate vicinity. That and the cold, and each other, and whatever they carried internally that allowed them to function when the external circumstances were making functionality very difficult. I want to stay close to the documented individual accounts here, because to me the most honest approach to this chapter is to not explain the human experience of Bastogne, but to let the existing record speak in the specific voice it uses. Private First Class Harold Porter, Company B, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, wrote a letter to his mother sometime around December 23rd that was never mailed. It was found folded inside his field jacket when he was evacuated with wounds on December 28th. The text of the letter, subsequently preserved in regimental records and quoted in historical accounts of the siege, begins, "Mom, I don't know if we get out of here or not. The food is gone except for 1 D-bar between me and Krupski. It is cold in a way I didn't know cold could be. But the funny thing is, I am not as scared as I thought I would be." Porter survived the battle. His fellow soldier Krupski did not. The letter is dated but never sent, sealed but never delivered. And it tells you what the operational summaries cannot, what the interior experience of Bastogne felt like to a private first class who was not sure whether he was going to go home. The 101st Airborne's medical records for December 19 through 27th document 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing within the division itself. Figures that don't include the attached and supporting units holding other sections of the perimeter alongside the paratroopers. Among the wounded, a category of injury appears that the operational summaries rarely isolate, but that the medical log tracks separately. 149 cases of trench foot. Trench foot is caused by prolonged exposure of wet feet to temperatures just above and below freezing. Not extreme cold, but the particular misery of sustained cold dampness that swells the tissue, damages the nerves, and in serious cases causes tissue death, requiring amputation. 31 of those 149 cases required field amputation. Trench foot is entirely preventable with dry socks and dry boots changed at regular intervals. The soldiers inside the Bastogne perimeter didn't have adequate access to either. The deficiency wasn't cruelty or neglect. It was the same supply chain failure that was rationing the artillery ammunition. The socks and the shells were caught in the same logistics shortfall. Technical Sergeant Harold Hafner, the bow machine gunner on the tank Cobra King, listed in the official Army photograph caption as one of the 5-man crew, kept a pocket diary and pencil throughout the advance. The diary was subsequently preserved through regimental records and partially transcribed by historians of the battle. His December 22nd entry reads, Road icy, lost PFC Osbolt to sniper, 10:30, drove until 0100. 3 facts. 1. Dead man. The diary continues in the same compressed format through the following days. Road conditions, names of the dead, movement until late. The compression isn't hardness. It's the prose style of a man who is processing more than he can afford to feel while it is happening. The diary maintains standard format throughout. There are no entries that deviate from the pattern of condition, casualty, movement. The pattern is itself a form of survival. The 326th Airborne Medical Company's records for December 24th document an event that appears in several survivor accounts, but receives only a brief clinical notation in the medical log. Tank fire struck the main aid station during the German Christmas Eve assault. The approximately 450 wounded being held at the station were moved to a basement that was simultaneously being used as an ammunition storage point. The medical log notes the move, the number of patients relocated, and the fact that several procedures were suspended during the movement and resumed afterward. The notation is made in the same handwriting and same ink as every other entry in the log. There is no line in the medical record that acknowledges the surreality of moving wounded men into an ammunition storage basement during an armored assault on Christmas Eve. The document just goes on. The forms continue. The institution persists through the events it records. In the weeks after Bastogne, the surviving soldiers of the 101st Airborne and the 4th Armored wrote letters home that have entered the historical record through family donations to archives, and the work of military historians who collected accounts from veterans in the post-war decades. Historian John McManus, whose research into the individual soldier experience of the Ardennes is the most thorough English-language work in this area, identified a recurring quality in these letters: an absence of triumphalism. Very few of the surviving letters celebrate the defense or describe the writers as heroes. The dominant register is exhaustion, loss, and what several writers describe as the unreality of having come through something so outside the range of normal experience that ordinary vocabulary doesn't quite fit it. Several soldiers write specifically that they do not feel like heroes, that the word doesn't match the experience, that the experience doesn't have a word that matches it, yet. One more figure deserves its own space in this chapter. Corporal James L. Washington, listed in convoy records as a driver with the 514th Quartermaster Truck Company, one of the black truck drivers who drove a 2.5-ton GMC through the Bastogne corridor at approximately 0300 on December 27th as part of the first resupply convoy. The Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy operation that had moved over 400,000 tons of supplies across France from August through November 1944, staffed approximately 70% by black soldiers, had officially closed on November 16th. Its drivers were still moving supplies in the same trucks, through the same nights, because the war had not closed with it. Washington gave an account of the drive in a unit history interview conducted in 1945, describing driving through what he called a storm where the rain was pointed. He was recommended for the Army Commendation Medal by his unit commander in January 1945. The recommendation is in the record. The decoration was denied. No explanation survives in the paperwork. Washington received the commendation posthumously in 1998 under the Department of Defense's review program for systematically denied decorations to black servicemen during the Second World War. He did not live to receive it in person. The unfinished letter from Harold Porter, the pocket diary with its 3-part daily entry, the medical log that moves the patients and goes on, the recommendation form with no answer written below it. These documents don't constitute a counter-narrative to the operational history. They are the operational history, viewed from the register at which it was actually experienced. The tonnages and the diversion factors and the G2 forecasts are how Bastogne was saved. These letters and logs are what it costs to save it, denominated in the currency that doesn't appear in the supply manifests. The corridor was open. The supplies were moving. The letters, mostly, were not going home yet. Chapter 13. The Argument at the Top. The 1st of January, 1945. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's headquarters, Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge was not yet formally over. German forces were still pressing against the Bastogne corridor. The counteroffensive to Houffalize was still weeks away, and the Ardennes front remained active and costly. In this context, Montgomery's staff was preparing a press conference. His staff advised against it. The battle wasn't finished. The atmosphere between Allied commands was already strained beyond what normal coalition friction explained. Montgomery went ahead. The events of the previous 2 weeks had produced what diplomatic historians sometimes call a secondary crisis, the one that develops while the primary crisis is still being resolved, fed by it, and feeding it in turn. The primary crisis was the German offensive. The secondary one was the Allied command structure tearing itself apart over how to respond to it. When Eisenhower transferred operational control of the American 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery on December 20th, he did so for sound operational reasons. The northern shoulder of the Bulge needed a unified command, and Montgomery's 21st Army Group was geographically positioned to provide it. The decision was operationally defensible. It was also, for Omar Bradley, personally devastating. He later called it the most distasteful order he had ever been given by a superior, and he described his reaction in terms that suggest his relationship with Eisenhower never fully recovered from it. The institutional wound was real, and it was bleeding for weeks before Montgomery opened his mouth to a room full of journalists. On January 7th, Montgomery lectured from notes for approximately an hour at a press conference convened at his headquarters. He described the battle's management from his perspective. He said, in substance, that the situation had been difficult, but had been handled, and that British forces had played a significant role in restoring the northern flank. The British press reported this as a tribute to Allied cooperation. The American press reported it as Montgomery claiming credit for saving an American disaster. Both interpretations were defensible from the same transcript, which is itself the most precise description of the problem. Montgomery had said something that meant 2 things simultaneously, and each side of the Atlantic heard the meaning that confirmed what it already believed about him. Patton's response, recorded in his diary for the period, is not suitable for verbatim quotation in a documentary of this kind. Eisenhower's reaction to the press conference is documented in the papers held at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. He drafted a cable to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, stating that he could no longer work effectively with Montgomery, and asking Marshall to prepare for the consequences of a formal confrontation. The cable was drafted. It was not sent. A British liaison officer privately warned Montgomery through back channels that Eisenhower had reached the limit of his tolerance. Montgomery subsequently sent Eisenhower a personal letter that was conciliatory in tone, backing away from the command authority claims that had been building since before the Battle of the Bulge. The confrontation was avoided. The coalition held. The drafted cable to Marshall, the one that would have fractured the Allied command structure at the moment of its greatest strategic opportunity, exists in the archive as the evidence of how close the coalition came to a self-inflicted wound from which it might not have recovered in time to matter. Behind this command drama, the deeper strategic argument was still unresolved. Montgomery had been pressing since the autumn of 1944 for a single-thrust strategy, concentrating Allied logistical power on one narrow axis of advance in the north, under his command, and driving directly into Germany while all other Allied armies were held essentially static. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, advancing along the entire line, maintaining pressure everywhere, preventing the Germans from stripping one sector to reinforce another, was the competing concept. The supply mathematics of the narrow thrust are documented in detail by the logistics staff analyses of the period. Concentrating on a single axis would have required approximately 95% of all Allied daily supply tonnage to flow to that one operation. The Red Ball Express had demonstrated that Allied logistics could deliver approximately 12,000 tons per day across the entire theater. A narrow thrust would need 8,000 to 9,000 tons per day on a single axis. Theoretically achievable, but only by immobilizing every other Allied force. The argument wasn't just about personality. It was about whether the supply system could support the strategy being demanded. Patton held his own view. He believed that the Ardennes crisis, rather than forcing a consolidation of Allied effort behind Montgomery's northern axis, created the opportunity for an aggressive southern thrust, a deep drive through the base of the Bulge, cutting off the entire German force west of the Rhine. His operations officer, Colonel Maddox, had proposed exactly this on December 17th, and Patton had agreed it was the correct military solution, but had also predicted, accurately, that those gentlemen up north would not authorize it. The Verdun Conference confirmed his prediction. Bastogne became the objective rather than the Rhine. Patton went where he was directed. He was not quiet about his disagreement, but he went. What the January command crisis reveals, when you read the cables and diary entries and conference transcripts together, is that the Allied coalition in the first weeks of 1945 was functioning on the operational level, while straining to the point of fracture on the personal and political level. Eisenhower was simultaneously managing a German offensive, a British field marshal who believed he should be running the entire ground campaign, an American Army Group commander who felt betrayed by the transfer of his armies, and a Third Army commander who believed the strategy being pursued was unnecessarily conservative. He managed all of this while also fighting the battle. The drafted but unsent cable to Marshall is the most honest document in this chapter. It shows the weight of what Eisenhower was carrying in those weeks, and the discipline with which he chose not to act on his most extreme option. To me, the most historically significant aspect of the January command crisis isn't the drama of Montgomery's press conference, or the near fracture of the coalition. It's what the crisis reveals about the fragility of coalition warfare as an organizational form. The Allied armies were genuinely the most powerful military force assembled in history to that point. They were also held together by relationships between specific individuals: Eisenhower's personal authority, Bradley's institutional loyalty, even Montgomery's calculation of what he could push and what would break him, that could have unraveled under exactly the kind of sustained pressure the Ardennes created. What prevented the unraveling wasn't doctrine or structure. It was the choices of 3 or 4 individuals, made over several weeks, to absorb provocation rather than respond to it. That is a very thin thread for the outcome of a world war to depend on, and the archive makes clear how thin it was. Patton's men were still on the frozen roads north of Bastogne. The corridor was being widened under fire. The cable to Marshall was in a drawer at Schaeff, unsent. The coalition held, for reasons that were more personal than structural, and the war went on. Chapter 14. What the Maps Don't Show. The 19th of December, 1944, Bastogne. The population of the town in peacetime was approximately 4,000. On the 19th of December, as the 101st Airborne was arriving on its trucks from Mourmelon, the town already held those 4,000 civilians, people who had not been evacuated, who had no clear means of evacuation, and who were now watching American soldiers dig in around their town and finding out by increments what was about to happen to it. They went to the cellars. They took food, water, whatever blankets they had. The nuns at the Bastogne convent opened their facility as an auxiliary shelter. The parish priest, Father Jean-Baptiste Mousti, whose diary of the siege period is one of the few civilian primary sources that survived the occupation and the liberation in a form that allows it to be read, noted the first American soldiers in the streets, the sound of artillery beginning in the east, and the moment when it became clear that the town was not going to be a thoroughfare for a retreating army, but a fortress that 2 armies would fight over. The Bastogne Municipal Register for December 1944 records 36 civilian deaths attributed to military action during the siege period. The entries are brief in the way that all such official records are brief in circumstances of mass disruption: name, age, cause, location. One entry, for a child of 7, lists cause as bombardment and location as a street in the town center, and carries no surname. The marginal annotation, in the registrar's hand, reads, "Family not located." I want to sit with that entry for a moment before moving on, because the archive's job in this case is to count, and sometimes the count produces a remainder that won't resolve into a clean number. A 7-year-old without a surname, in a city register, is not an abstraction, but the register can't make them more than that. It records only what it can record. Father Musti's diary covers the siege in daily entries that are spare and precise, in a way that is partly the product of his journalism training. He was, like several clergy of his era, a man who had worked with words before entering the priesthood, and partly the product of the particular discipline that keeps a person writing when the writing could stop at any moment. He notes the first German artillery on the 16th. He notes the American trucks arriving. He notes the opening of the church cellars to civilians who had no other shelter. He notes, on December 23rd, the incendiary shells that struck the town center and the fires that followed. The civilian firefighting equipment, he writes, had been requisitioned earlier in the siege for anti-aircraft use. There was nothing to fight the fires with. 6 civilians died in the bombardment of the 23rd. The American operations records for that day note the fires as a tactical concern for supply storage. The gap between what the American records document and what the Belgian civilian records document is not the product of dishonesty. It's the product of two different institutions recording the same events from two different positions of interest. Military after-action reports document military effects on military objectives. Civilian deaths in the surrounding space require a different institutional will to count, and in most cases that will didn't exist in the same organizations. The Belgian survivor testimonies collected by the Bastogne Historical Center in the 1980s and 90s, decades after the battle, when the people who remembered it were old enough to be historians and young enough to still remember, document at least 4 civilian deaths attributed to American artillery, falling short of its intended targets and landing within the perimeter. The American after-action reports record 0 civilian casualties from American fire. Both sets of documents are primary sources. Neither set is fabricated. The discrepancy between 0 and 4 is a product of what each institution was designed to record, which is its own kind of evidence. The nuns of the Bastogne convent are named in the 326th Airborne Medical Company's log. Specifically, the medical company commander's report thanks Les Religieuses de Bastogne for nursing assistance and donated civilian medical supplies during the siege. This notation is unusual in an American military medical record. The inclusion of civilian names, in French, in a U.S. Army document is a small archival disruption that indexes something real. The civilian population of Bastogne was not passive. They hid in cellars, and they nursed the wounded, and they donated what they had to the defense of their own town. And the medical company commander noticed and wrote it down. The notation is 2 lines. It's also the only point in the American primary sources where the specific civilian contribution to the Bastogne defense is formally acknowledged. Father Musty's diary entry for December 27th records 2 things in close succession: the news that the American relief column had broken through from the south, and the observation that American soldiers had begun taking provisions from houses along the main street. He uses the phrase prendre des provisions, taking provisions. He does not use the word looting. American operations documents characterize the practice as emergency requisition, which is the formal military term for taking civilian property under operational necessity. The difference between taking provisions and emergency requisition is largely a matter of which side of the door you are on. Musty notes both things without resolving the tension between them. The town was liberated. Food was being taken from houses. Both of these things were true simultaneously on December 27th, and they coexisted in the diary entry without hierarchy. An estimated 2,500 civilians were killed across Belgium as a direct or indirect result of the Battle of the Bulge, with approximately 500 more in Luxembourg. These are the figures compiled by post-war historical surveys of the broader Ardennes campaign. For the Bastogne area specifically, the town and the surrounding communes, the estimates of civilian deaths across the full siege and liberation period run to over 100. The Belgian parliamentary investigation, conducted in the post-war years, documented the war damage to the commune of Bastogne at a figure that, converted at wartime exchange rates, represented a significant fraction of the total Marshall Plan aid received by Belgium. For a town of 4,000 people, that is a number that doesn't fit neatly inside the operational narrative it is simultaneous with. The Church of St. Peter in Bastogne, where Father Musty sheltered his parishioners, whose stained glass windows were destroyed by the December 23rd bombardment, was rebuilt in the 1950s, with new windows incorporating American military imagery alongside Catholic iconography, the funding provided in part by the United States Army. The windows exist. They can be visited. The theology that put American military imagery in the glass of a Belgian church that had been damaged by artillery fire from multiple directions is a complex one, and Father Musty's diary offers no verdict on it. The diary simply stops at liberation, as diaries often do when the immediate emergency passes and the longer process of living with what happened begins. The 36 names in the municipal register, the 7-year-old with no surname, the nuns who are thanked in 2 lines of a medical log, Father Musty writing in a cellar while shells fell on the town above him. These are the coordinates of what the maps of the Bastogne battle don't show. The fixed human geography of a town that neither army asked permission to fight over, that neither army's records fully counted, and that the popular narrative of Bastogne has consistently treated as backdrop rather than as subject. The archive doesn't resolve this, it only reveals it, which is a different thing. Chapter 15. Patton's Brilliant Flaw. The 3rd of January 1945. The Ardennes front north of Bastogne. The corridor was still being held and widened by engineers under fire. The German counterattack to seal it had been beaten back. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne had been reinforced and resupplied. The operational situation had shifted from desperate to merely difficult, which, in the context of what the previous 2 weeks had been, felt almost like relief. It wasn't relief. The 3rd Corps was about to be ordered north through the worst terrain in the Ardennes, on a timeline that several of the officers responsible for executing it believed was unrealistic, toward a link-up with the First Army at Houffalize that would formally cut off the German salient. The decision was operationally correct. The execution was going to cost considerably more than the planning assumed. Patton's January operations are the part of the Bastogne story that the myth tends to leave at the edge of the frame. The film ends at the corridor opening. The popular accounts conclude with the relief on December 26th as the climax of the campaign. The Third Army's actual operations continued for another month and a half, through terrain that was significantly more difficult than the approach to Bastogne, against German defenses that had been consolidated and reorganized, in weather that the meteorological records for January 1945 show was worse than December. The Third Corps' attack northward toward Houffalize, ordered on January 1st and executed from January 3rd, was conducted through the Our River Valley and its tributary systems, a landscape of dense forest and natural defensive barriers, spaced approximately 3 to 5 kilometers apart along the axis of advance. Each barrier required engineer assets to bridge. Each prepared German defensive position on the far bank required a deliberate attack to reduce. The terrain was, in the assessment of the official army history, the worst in the Ardennes, and this is being said about the Ardennes, which is not known for gentle going. Patton's diary entries for the first 2 weeks of January show something that the December entries don't. The confidence is still there, the certainty that aggressive pressure will produce results faster than cautious consolidation. But beneath it, visible in the repeated entries criticizing Milliken and the Third Corps for insufficient speed, is the particular frustration of a commander watching his own optimistic timeline fail in real time. Milliken must be bolder, he writes, on another day. Third Corps is too cautious. The Third Corps operations log for the same period documents, in its own characteristically dry format, the actual reasons for the rate of advance. Destroyed bridges at 3 separate river crossings. German anti-tank guns engaging at ranges under 200 meters from concealed positions in tree cover. Supply limitations created by the single road running north from Bastogne that was still under intermittent artillery fire. The terrain imposed a schedule. Patton's diary recorded his displeasure with it. The two documents don't contradict each other. They describe the same situation from opposite positions of frustration. The Third Corps' total battle casualties for January 1 through 16, the Houffalize operation, ran to approximately 6,000. 600 men killed and wounded across all units engaged. This is a figure of the same order of magnitude as the casualties incurred in the original drive to relieve Bastogne, achieved against a smaller and less strategically significant objective. The Third Army's overall casualty rate for January 1945 ran to approximately 880 per day across all corps. By comparison, the rate during the December period that included the German offensive and the Bastogne relief was approximately 650 per day. January was, by the most direct measure of American losses per day, the Third Army's bloodiest month of the campaign. This fact appears in the casualty appendices of the Third Army's final after-action report. It is not cited in most popular accounts of Patton's performance in the Ardennes. Milliken's relief of command came in March 1945. Patton replaced him with Major General James Van Fleet, and the stated reason was insufficient drive in Third Corps operations. Whether this reflects a genuine command failure by Milliken, or whether it reflects a commander being asked to take formal responsibility for an operational situation that was shaped at least partly by unrealistic timelines set above his level, that is a question the archive cannot fully resolve. What the archive contains is Milliken's post-war oral history, conducted at the Army Military History Institute, in which he addresses his command relationship with Patton with a precision that is itself a kind of evidence. General Patton, he says, was always very clear about what he wanted. He was sometimes less interested in hearing about what was preventing it. The historian's marginal note on the transcript, note, this appears carefully worded, is its own small witness. I want to be direct about the interpretive challenge here, because this is a chapter where the evidence points in two directions, and the documentary record doesn't cleanly support either conclusion. Milliken may have been insufficiently aggressive in the January operations. The Army's formal judgment was that he was, and the Army's formal judgment carries weight. It's also possible that the January operations were planned on a timeline that the terrain and the German defense made impossible to achieve, and that Milliken is carrying operational costs that were partly incurred at the planning level. Both things can be true simultaneously in a military operation, and history tends to resolve such ambiguities in favor of whoever was making the accusations, rather than whoever was receiving them. The Third Corps operational records from January suggest that the adjustments to the original plan, acknowledged in the Corps' own operational summary, were more extensive and more fundamental than the Third Army's after-action report language of executed according to plan would suggest. Van Fleet, the replacement, went on to command United States forces in Korea from 1951 to 1952, where he is remembered as one of the most effective Corps-level commanders of the Cold War. Whatever the justice or injustice of Milliken's relief, Patton's judgment of Van Fleet as the right man to replace him was borne out across the following decade. The two facts can coexist. An action can be unfair in its immediate application and correct in its underlying personnel assessment. These things happen in military organizations, more often than the formal record acknowledges. The pattern that becomes visible across Patton's Ardennes command, December's extraordinary operational achievement followed by January's costly overreach, is one that military historians have been wrestling with since the 1940s. The same quality that drove the pivot, the pre-planning, the confidence at Verdun, the insistence on attacking when others would consolidate. That same quality, applied without sufficient regard for terrain constraints and supply realities, produced the January operations that are less celebrated, not because they were less dramatic, but because they were less successful relative to their cost. Patton was at his most powerful when the operational situation rewarded audacity and penalized caution. He was at his least controlled when audacity continued to be demanded after the situation had changed into something that rewarded patience. December rewarded audacity. January rewarded patience. Patton could not shift registers. Van Fleet moved the Corps headquarters north. The January operations continued. Milliken flew back to a command in the United States and later retired. His oral history sits in an archive in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, carefully worded, waiting to be read by someone with time to notice the precision with which a general officer can describe having been treated unfairly without using those words. Chapter 16. The Myth Factory. The year 1970, Hollywood. A film about a general who has been dead for 25 years opens in American cinemas with a scene that has no equivalent in any diary, any after-action report, or any documented account of anything that actually happened. George C. Scott, playing George S. Patton, stands in front of an enormous American flag and delivers a speech about war to a crowd of invisible soldiers. The speech is assembled from fragments of actual Patton speeches, edited, rearranged, and amplified for the cinema. It is magnificent. It is also, as a piece of historical documentation, the same category of evidence as a painting. It tells you what someone in 1970 wanted to believe about a man who died in 1945, shaped by the aesthetic and political requirements of 1970 rather than the facts of the preceding 25 years. The film Patton, directed by Franklin Schaffner and produced with the screenplay co-credited to Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund North, won 7 Academy Awards including Best Picture. It is one of the most financially successful war films in cinema history, grossing approximately $89 million worldwide on a budget of $12 million. Richard Nixon watched it multiple times in the White House. The film's opening became one of the most famous single scenes in American cinema, and the historical figure it depicts, the eccentric, brilliant, profane, visionary Patton, became, for the generation that grew up with the film, the definitive mental image of the man. Not the man in the diaries, not the man in Gay's accounts, not the man in Koch's monograph. The man played by George C. Scott, in a specific cinematographic interpretation, in 1970. The specific scene most relevant to Bastogne doesn't exist in any primary source. In the film, Patton walks among the graves of fallen soldiers at the Bastogne perimeter and delivers a meditation on war and glory. It's staged in a way that is visually striking and emotionally resonant and historically invented. Patton did visit Bastogne. He did visit grave sites. There is no documented account of any scene resembling the film's version from his diary, from Gay's diary, or from any of the officers who were present. The scene was written because it serves the film's emotional architecture at that point in the narrative. It serves that architecture very well. It has no archival support. What the film gets right is harder to summarize than what it invents, because the things it gets right are partly matters of atmosphere and character. Patton was eccentric, theatrical, professionally brilliant, and personally difficult. The film captures this without, in most cases, falsifying it. The Verdun scene, in which Patton announces he can attack in 48 hours to a room full of incredulous generals, is compressed and dramatized, but not fundamentally dishonest about what happened. The rendering of Patton's relationship with Bradley catches something real about the institutional friction between them. These are legitimate cinematic choices. The problem isn't that the film lies. The problem is that the film's version of the truth is now, for most people alive today, more present and more vivid than the documentary record's version, and the two versions are not identical. Coppola's screenplay history is itself worth examining. He was hired to write the script and submitted a version that was, by multiple accounts, darker and more ambiguous in its portrait of Patton, more interested in the costs of the man's character than in its gifts, less interested in heroism as an uncomplicated value. His draft was substantially rewritten. Scott reportedly agreed to take the role specifically on the condition that the more complex Coppola characterization be preserved, rather than replaced by a straightforwardly heroic portrait. The extent to which the final film reflects Coppola's intentions versus the rewrite is a matter of film scholarship rather than military history. But the parallel between the Coppola script story and the Koch memoir story is difficult to ignore. The more complicated, more archivally honest version of the man lost to a cleaner narrative in both cases. The Army's own history production process shaped the Bastogne narrative in ways that predate the film by 20 years. The official history of the Ardennes campaign, published by the Army Center of Military History, was prepared in the years immediately following the war, from after-action reports, war diaries, and command interviews. The choices made in that document, which controversies to acknowledge, how to weight Patton's contribution against the 101st's defense, how to frame the intelligence failure, became the structural template for virtually every subsequent popular account. These choices were made by professional historians working within an institution that had interests in how the narrative was framed, and most of the men being written about were still alive and in active careers. The resulting history is careful and detailed and scrupulously sourced. It is not neutral. Popular histories of Bastogne tend to share a structural feature that I've noticed in the course of this research. They end at December 26th. The opening of the corridor, Bogus's handshake, Patton's phone call to Gay, these are the conclusion. The subsequent 2 weeks of corridor defense, the January fighting, the Houffalize operation with its 6,600 casualties, the Milliken relief, the command crisis over Montgomery's press conference, these appear, if at all, in epilogues. The reason for this structural choice is clear. The story that ends at the corridor opening is a story with a satisfying arc. The story that continues into January is a more complicated story about the costs of success and the institutional pressures that shape how commanders get judged after battles. The first story sells books and films. The second story is harder to frame as entertainment. The process by which historical events become myths follows a sequence that the Bastogne case makes unusually visible because the documentation of each stage is relatively rich. Primary documents are created in the moment, imperfect, incomplete, shaped by the interests and limitations of their authors. Official histories synthesize the primary documents, selecting, framing, sometimes softening the hardest edges. Popular histories adapt the official histories with narrative simplification. Films and television dramatizations adapt popular histories with commercial and dramatic priorities. At each stage, selection occurs. At each stage, certain facts are consistently dropped, while others are consistently amplified. The facts that are dropped across multiple retellings, civilian casualties, the work logs of the engineers, the quartermaster truck drivers, the correction of Milliken's oral history, tell you something about what the myth requires to function. The myth of Bastogne requires clean heroism. The archive keeps insisting on mixed evidence. I want to acknowledge something directly. This documentary is itself part of the process it's describing. The choices I've made in these chapters, which sources to lead with, which contradictions to surface, which figures to bring forward from the margins, are not neutral choices. They are interpretive choices made by a specific researcher at a specific historical moment, shaped by what seems important in 2026 and what the archive makes available. This narration doesn't make the myth go away, it adds another layer. What distinguishes this attempt from the previous ones is not objectivity, nobody has that, but the willingness to show the seams, the contradictions between the after-action reports, the gap between the film scene and the diary, the procurement stamp on the document nobody read. Showing the seams is the closest thing to honesty that a documentary can achieve. The film plays on screens somewhere tonight, 55 years after its release. The flag fills the frame, Scott's voice fills the theater, and somewhere in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, a 4-page mimeographed supply table from December 22, 1944, has a column labeled Diversion Factor with the number 73 in it, and nobody is reading it. Chapter 17. What Bastogne Proved. The 9th of December 1971, not the 9th of December 1944, 27 years later, a small military history press published a monograph by Brigadier General Oscar Koch titled G2, Intelligence for Patton. It sold fewer than 2,000 copies. It was never reviewed by a major publication. It was never adapted for film or television. It has been out of print for most of its existence. The dedication page contains no names, only a list of job titles. The analysts, the clerks, the drivers, the men who were right and not heard. Koch died in 1970, the year the film about his commanding general won 7 Academy Awards, before the book was published. He was inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame in 1993. A barracks at Fort Huachuca bears his name. Most people who know the story of Bastogne have never heard of him. The monograph's closing argument is the clearest statement of what Bastogne actually proved, stripped of the theatrics and the mythology. Koch wrote that the failure preceding the Battle of the Bulge was not a failure of intelligence collection. The data was there. It was a failure of evaluation and application. The information moved through the correct channels. The routing stamps were applied. The reports were filed. What failed was the institutional willingness to accept an unwanted conclusion from available evidence and act on it before events forced the action. This is, as Koch observed, a different kind of failure from the dramatic intelligence collapse that the popular narrative implies. It's quieter, more structural, and considerably harder to fix through organizational reform because it isn't primarily an organizational problem. It's a human one. Institutions are built by people who reward the right answers. The right answers are not always welcome. The formal operational lessons extracted from the Bastogne campaign by the Army's own post-war analysis are documented in the Third Army's final after-action report, Volume 2, Staff Section Reports, a document that is held in the National Archives and is rarely cited in popular histories because it is written in the bureaucratic vocabulary of military logistics and staff procedure rather than the vocabulary of heroism. The lessons are precise and unglamorous. Pre-authorized logistics movement based on probabilistic threat assessment rather than confirmed orders. Decentralize intelligence fusion to core level, where the connection between raw data and operational decision-making is most direct. Pre-survey engineer crossing requirements before operational need forces the work under fire. Empower subordinate commanders to take initiative consistent with the commander's intent, without waiting for specific authorization for each specific action. These lessons are the operational substance of what Koch called the Bastogne lesson. They are also, in every essential respect, what the Army now calls mission command. Mission command, formalized in Army Doctrine Publication 6.0, first published in 2012 and revised in 2019, defines the principle as the exercise of authority and direction by the commander using mission orders to enable disciplined initiative within the commander's intent. The language is new, the concept isn't. Muller moving 8,000 tons of artillery ammunition north without written authorization. Abrams identifying the Assinois route from a locally found Belgian topographic map. Milliken moving his corps staff north before Bradley had formally authorized the attack. These are all instances of disciplined initiative within the commander's intent. Mission command, executed by officers who had never read the doctrine publication and who would have been puzzled by the term. The doctrine formalized in 2012 is, in its deepest intellectual roots, a description of what worked in December 1944, written with the benefit of 70 years of institutional analysis. The connection to the Gulf War of 1991 is documented rather than merely implied. General Frederick Franks, who commanded the 7th Corps in Operation Desert Storm's famous Left Hook, the sweeping western envelopment that encircled Iraqi forces in Kuwait, had studied Patton's Bastogne logistics at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The structural parallel between the 3rd Corps pivot from December 22, 1944, and the 7th Corps envelopment of January to February 1991 is visible in both the operational maps and the logistics records. A large armored force executing a rapid change of axis across an extended front, sustained by pre-staged supply depots positioned before formal authorization was received for the movement they were intended to support. 63,000 tons of supplies in 5 days in 1944. Comparable pre-positioning in the Saudi desert in 1991. Different desert, same architecture. What is less tidy about the doctrine legacy of Bastogne is the part that the doctrine publications don't address directly, the punishment of the people who took the initiative. Muller received no specific decoration for pre-staging the supplies that made the pivot possible. The action exists in the record as a fait accompli rather than a decision, which means the person who made the decision is largely invisible in the official history. Milliken, who moved his corps staff north before receiving formal authorization, was eventually relieved of command, a relief that may or may not have been just, but that was certainly a signal to future subordinate commanders about the risks of initiative. Army Doctrine Publication 6.0's 2019 revision added language specifically addressing the obligation of commanders not to punish subordinates for unsuccessful but reasonable exercises of initiative. This language is in the current doctrine. It is there because the history showed, repeatedly, that without it, the doctrine would not be practiced, that the institutional incentive structure of military organizations tends to reward inaction over initiative when inaction preserves careers. When I look at the full scope of what the Third Army accomplished between December 9th and January 16th, from Koch's briefing to the Houffalize link-up, what I find is an organization that performed brilliantly in some respects and paid avoidable costs in others, in a pattern that is too consistent to be coincidental. The brilliant performance tends to involve individuals who took initiative beyond their formal authority. Koch, who briefed an unwelcome conclusion. Gay and Muller, who pre-staged supplies without written orders. Abrams, who identified an unissued map and proposed an unplanned route. The avoidable costs tend to involve the institutional response to success, the overconfident January timelines, the relief of an officer who may have been executing an impossible plan, the supply system always running one step behind the commander's demands. The same organization, the same month, two very different relationships between individual initiative and institutional culture. The archive that Koch dedicated his monograph to, the analysts, the clerks, the drivers, the men who were right and not heard, is not metaphorical. It is the literal collection of documents that this documentary series has been working through. The G2 periodic reports with their routing stamps, the supply diversion tables with their columns of percentages, the work logs of the engineers noting when the shelling started and when it stopped, and how many meters of corduroy had been laid in between. The pocket diary with its 3-part daily entry, the draft cable to Marshall that was never sent, the Belgian municipal register with the 7-year-old without a surname. Every one of those documents was created by a person at a specific desk, in a specific building, in a specific winter, under conditions that ranged from professionally routine to personally terrifying. Most of those people are not in the film. Most of them are not in the popular histories. Their contribution to the outcome of the battle exists in the record in the form of facts, tonnages and diversion factors, and road improvement rates, rather than in the form of narrative. The documentary tradition has always been more comfortable with the man in the flag-filled frame than with the clerk filling in the diversion factor column. This is understandable. It is also a form of forgetting that the archive resists, quietly, by continuing to exist.